Hello everybody, my name is Lotte Petersen. I work here as the curator at Wysing Art Center. I just want to welcome you all to this event today, the Multiverse Autumn Residency event, which is the first event of the residencies that we have here over the late autumn, November, December time. And it takes the multiverse as the whole program of Wysing this year is the multiverse as an artistic starting point for experimentation and inquiry. And artists in residence, Essi Kausalainen and Purgas and Erica Scourti are here during November, December to research and develop new works that may occur during the autumn, but also obviously in the future of their artistic practice. And the way we've structured this event today has been very much in collaboration with the artist as a way to unfold their ideas and research. And within that format, the artist and us at Wysing, we've been discussing about different possibilities of speakers to bring in and actually to support that. So we're very honored and really thrilled that writer and curator Paul Clinton, Irene Revell, curator and director of Electra, and Dr. James Riley, lecturer in English at the Cambridge University, they're all actually coming in to contribute to this process and to try and open up ideas together with the artist and together with you today. The event is from 2 to 6, and throughout the whole day in the reception area at Wysing, Paul Purgas has been so generous and kind to compose a sound score, a pre-recorded sound that is then being developed into a sound score that will actually kind of perform or be played in the reception area throughout the day. And Paul has also agreed that the sound score will be broadcast in the breaks in this day on to an online audience. So those who are actually sitting here online, welcome to you as well, because we are broadcasting this event on This Is Tomorrow. So do also take the opportunity when we have a break here at Wysing to listen to Paul Purgas' sound score. On that note, actually, this is just a practical note. Could everybody here in this room switch off their phones, because that might actually disturb the broadcast. Thank you. So what we do is that we start with an in-conversation in between Erica Scourti and Paul Clinton, and each of them will present some of their research ideas that would merge into this in-conversation around stupidity, the self and identities. So that's very exciting, and the in-conversation will be followed by questions and open discussion with you. So do feel that you can approach Erica and Paul. And then we'll have a break in the reception area, and that would then, after the break, come back to this space again, the open studio, for a presentation by James Riley entitled Ghost Noise, which is a speculative talk looking at cybernetics and paranormal in the 60s, 70s. And that talk will be followed by Q&A with Paul Purgas, and after there, in conversation, we'll open it up to you as well to come in with questions. Then a quick comfy break after this section, and then that will take us into a film screening by Essi Kausalainen before the in-conversation of Irene Revell and Essi Kausalainen. And followed by that, we will have again a chance for you to join into the in-conversation. And after all of these different discussions and useful way of opening up the research, we'll have some drinks in the reception area. So on that note, I will give you, Paul Clinton and Erica Scourti, the word. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, Lotte.
Yeah.
So as mentioned, the format of this portion of the event will be a discussion between Erica and myself on our research projects, hers particularly on the female fool and the dark archive, and mine on stupidity in relation to queerness and the construction of subjectivity. We're then going to spin off into an exploration of some of the common questions and themes raised by our projects, And some of those that we've been thinking about include questioning the urge to fight for visibility, intelligibility and common understanding on the part of minoritarian subjects, the limits of parody and critique and forms of agency gained from them, as well as the problematic knowingness that attends to such strategies, and how these link up to theories of performative identity. So there's quite a lot there, but hopefully we'll unpack it. I'm going to begin by outlining what I mean by stupidity and the ways in which I've attempted to interrogate that notion. Then Erica will talk a little bit about her current research before we discuss. Just a bit of background, which is that I began working on stupidity almost 10 years ago as part of doctoral research, and then edited a couple of academic journals about the subject before recently putting together an exhibition which is currently on at Focal Point Gallery, and it will be there for the next 5 months. So and that explores some of the themes we're going to discuss and some images from it up there. So one of the most interesting things about stupidity is its slipperiness. It resists our attempts to fix, identify and use it. To speak from a position of stupidity would be a good way to counter intellectual superiority, and yet it is nearly impossible to embrace stupidity intentionally. So its slipperiness is key. Of course, we might also be attracted to its irreverence, the campy, playful, performative iconoclasm and trashiness of the topic. I want to draw upon an example, from a series of works by the artist collective Bank entitled Facts Back, because I think this offers a way to open up the meaning of the term stupidity. In this series, the artists corrected the press releases of commercial art galleries as if they were student essays, pointing out the cliches, empty rhetoric, misappropriated terminology, false erudition, and nonsense of art world language, providing comments and giving each one a low mark out of 10 before faxing it back to the offending gallery. They position themselves as pricking the pomposity of the art world and tearing away its mask of pseudo-intellectualism. Yet by asserting their own intellectual superiority in the process, the artists knowingly make themselves look somewhat pompous and pedantic. They take on the role of critics, whose stance of authority and rightness makes their thinking rigid, as if preventing them from seeing how ridiculous their pedantry appears. As such, they seem to lack the capacity for self-reflection which full and genuine insight demands. Thus unable to reflect upon their own actions as critics, the smart artists appear somewhat stupid themselves, whereas in fact they are mounting a dual critique against both the pedant and the art world, which in itself constitutes a form of self-reflexivity. But part of the humour of this series comes from its failure to escape stupidity. For even the artist's dual critique becomes a means of establishing intellectual superiority, the very thing that keeps pompous critics trapped in the form of their own judgment. By showing that there is a kind of intellectualism that is in fact stupid, Facts Back raises the notion that stupidity cannot simply be defined as a form of error or lack of intelligence, but instead describes a more complex set of problems. The scholars from Derrida to Deleuze and Ronel have pointed out that stupidity is not opposed to intelligence in any simple way, then it becomes a particularly fugitive category of thought, one difficult to locate or take a position on without risking being in stupidity, that is, being reductive and too fixed in one's definition. Although always having something to do with knowledge relations, whether that be the knowledge and understanding of the self or others, or the ways in which knowledge does or does not function, the limits of one's ability to understand, know and relate. So stupidity is an ethical question. We can think here how often when we imagine we are being at our smartest, we are at our most stupid, in the manner of Bank. And the effect of realising this has profound repercussions for our sense of self, for our ability to know and have a coherent picture of ourselves. And in my own research, I was particularly interested in how this self-otherness, this distance from oneself at the moment one thinks one gains insight into oneself, might be useful for a queer politics that questions coherent selfhood. I was also my research then also looked into ways in which this refusal of understanding, also the failures of understanding between the self or the other, might intersect with what scholars such as Kay Mitchell have called the politics of unintelligibility. That is, the claim that rather than rendering oneself understandable or assimilating to systems of meaning or understanding within a biased, heteronormative social order, queer subjects might embrace their unintelligibility, might try to avoid making themselves understandable in order to dissent from and not ratify given meanings. But I wanted to look at the ways in which attending to stupidity might complicate that. For example, if you render yourself, how do you escape the accusation of stupidity if you're rendering yourself unintelligible? You know, if you refuse to make yourself understandable, then what's to say that the dominant culture can't simply dismiss what you're doing as stupid, as not worth listening to, as a form of protest or dissent? And I was interested in the ways in which these practices of unintelligibility intersected with a whole group of performance practices that involved queer performance practices that involved engaging in non-serious, in nonsense, in silliness as a form, as a generative political practice. And so I think equally I was interested in the ways in which stupidity might complicate the politics of unintelligibility precisely because it resists being turned into a form of agency. You know, if you how can one write about stupidity or work with stupidity without positioning oneself as being smart? How does one write about or make work about the subject without neatly separating critical insights from stupidity and therefore reinscribing the opposition of intelligence and stupidity? Or how does one turn stupidity into a strategy, or even unintelligibility into a strategy, without either making sense of it or turning it into a new form of cleverness, and therefore for losing the kind of fundamental non-relationality that makes it do its work, that makes it question the process of understanding. And so those were some of the kinds of themes and questions that was raised in I was raising in my research that I thought might be interesting to discuss, and that I think have some contiguity with what Erica's been working on. And perhaps, Erica, you want to talk a little bit about the dark archives and your interest in them and how this fits in.
Yeah, great. Yeah, because I was just thinking I suppose the thing is with the stupidity is that as you were saying towards the end, there's a knowingness there, isn't there? So there is a sense of it's knowing that there's something that you don't know. And kind of playing with that in some way. I guess, I don't know, I was just thinking that because some of my research, I've spent many years working with ideas of archives in different ways, and everything from like the digital archives that we create simply by using online space and YouTube and Amazon and all of these things. And this has gone into quite a few different works I've done, but I became interested in the idea of, I noticed how the term making visible was being used a lot as a way of making claims, making certain political claims, I guess, for agency. And particularly it's something that I noticed in the field of people who, like myself, I guess, who are interested in technology and some of the associated things that go with it, like surveillance and the ways that big data is collected and all the things that kind of come through that. There can be this drive amongst artists to make visible the workings of these institutions, and I think it does actually link back to a form of institutional critique, even though it's definitely not called that. I've thought of it maybe as being a kind of infrastructural critique, but there is, in a sense, the same thing at play, which is has been described by many different people, but it could be, I think it's Wendy Chun describes it as the code fetish, which is the idea that if we can just get to the code and make these things visible and expose them, then immediately all of these social issues and political problems will kind of fall into place. And as we know, that generally doesn't happen. So I guess I began to question my own use of the expression making visible, because I definitely had used it in some of my older work. For example, Life in AdWords, which was an almost year-long diaristic project where I was sending my diaries, my daily diaries, to my Gmail account, and then the keywords and phrases that it generated, I was then performing to webcam every day, and I collected those into month-long segments and then into a whole long diary. And even though there's many other things at play within that project, one of the ways that I found myself describing it was that, it makes visible the way that the Web 2.0 economy operates on the idea of the exchange of our personal data for the free service. And so anyway, that was kind of, I started to think about the limitations of this making visible, and actually then Paul sent me a link to an essay I remember coming across ages ago but not really reading properly, which was Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's Paranoid Reading. You're so paranoid you probably think this essay is about you. And there's loads of stuff in there that really kind of reiterate that. She's not talking about tech or about surveillance or about necessarily Google archives, but she's talking about the way that a certain claim and a certain faith even and trust is put in the kind of agency of exposure. And she gives lots and lots of different examples of kind of paranoid, what could be called kind of paranoid readings, and she goes on to argue that it's actually become the kind of dominant way of approaching things, which is this thing of like constantly uncovering, and she also points out the way that there's a kind of a power relation implied within that, because it implies that the ones making, doing the uncovering and the exposing and the investigating are in a position of kind of cleverness, let's say, in relation to the people who they're showing it to. And of course, I think, as artists, that can be quite tricky, because there's a certain claim for superiority and even kind of like paternalism in that, or kind of pedagogy of kind of I'm now going to uncover these things and then show them to you. So again, there's some kind of implication there that's a bit problematic, but.
I mean, that's in a weird way, the one of the terms that I was trying to introduce with stupidity and its relationship to theories of gender performativity or parody, the use of parody, which is that parody always implies a knowingness about its object, and also implies precisely that lack of power relation. But the other thing that Eve Sedgwick wants to talk about is the ways in which, so it assumes certain stability of knowledge or a certain ability to know and understand, whereas actually the most useful thing might be to want to question one's purchase on knowing, question, that it actually sort of ratifies an identity position stabilised as a subject, that form of knowingness, and which would seem to be precisely a kind of unqueer move. But I think also one of the really interesting things in Sedgwick's paper is the difference between reparative reading and paranoid reading, which is that paranoid reading keeps you in this sort of oppositional relationship to your object of critique, and it doesn't offer alternative or more hospitable ways of being. It's only good at breaking things down. It's only good at exposing the workings of ideology. Well, that can be very useful to work out the ways in which misogyny is at work in society or heteronormativity. On the other hand, how much does it tell you? I mean, you also, one knows one lives in a avowedly heteronormative society. One knows one lives in a largely misogynistic society. What one really ought to be doing is finding other more hospitable modes of being practices of reading that allow other identities to articulate themselves, and that a paranoid reading that's all about uncovering is not particularly constructive. It's not a generative practice in that sense, or it might not be. And so I was also interested in the ways in which we might get beyond parody, we might get beyond critique towards other practices, and I think that's something you're interested in too.
Yeah, I think because a couple of years ago, what I was really interested in and wrote my kind of dissertation about at college was the idea of the female fool, and that my kind of, I mean, again, I'm sure it's very well trodden, but it's a type of parody which has got it's looking at kind of complicity and critique. So how you can become complicit within the things which you are attempting to critique, and I think that in itself can be quite a slippery slope, because it can be quite easy to actually end up just reinforcing whatever those things are. And the same goes for, I think, artists who work in nothing to do with gender or female stereotyping, but in terms of kind of almost emulating the things which they are critiquing. But anyway, so the female form, the thing that I got interested there was the idea of a kind of masochistic relationship or a kind of masochistic humour, which was a sense of submitting yourself to the law, to whatever this law is. So the law could be the stereotype surrounding femininity, let's say. Submitting yourself to it and almost exaggerating it and kind of taking it on so fully in a way that maybe has got some relationship with the idea of stupidity, that exposes it, so there's that expression again, exposes it as a law, as a stereotype, and not as something intrinsic or essential or in any way biologically connected to being female. So again, that was my kind of idea of the female fool. Basically, it was looking at subversive approaches to parody in feminist performance art. But
you see, the thing about stupidity is that it somewhat complicates these notions, because if one notion of stupidity would be that it's, what I was saying before about it not being opposed to intelligence, this idea, one form of stupidity, one definition of stupidity would be of a kind of rigid form of knowing, so that you can fail at understanding, not simply by not following, not getting, whatever it is, but by assuming knowledge, by assuming to know. And so there might be forms of parodic femininity that assume a common ground of dissent amongst, say, it's the classic problem of any form of identity politics that in order to assume, let's say, that we want to reject some notion of womanliness, to have solidarity as feminists against one notion of womanliness, you have to have a common ground against about what you find objectionable, and perhaps implicitly within that to posit another model of womanliness to counter it, which is just as restrictive and subjective, that all of our ways of knowing can become ossified in such a way that they actually limit the multiplicity of understandings or possibilities from which they could be drawn, and so they become just as solidified. And so that attending to stupidity would be to attend to this impossibility of getting to a kind of perfectible state of knowingness, and what alternative models we might have for politics and that. I mean, I think one of the things that we were talking about before, just to return to it, which is around the problems of visibility, or the problems of struggles for recognition, for intelligibility. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what you think those problems are and why you think they're worth addressing? Just in general, or in your work, how you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this thing of the visible, I think it's been talked about quite a lot in terms of being visible being both a privilege and a type of burden and a type of curse. And again, because of my own research into looking at things like surveillance and like these types of archives, there can be questions around. This is what I was particularly interested in, this project called the Outage, which was actually ended up being a book published by Banner Repeater, but there you can see it on the left. This is how it looked in the gallery. So it's printed out archives and information. But one of the things I was interested in there was things to do with when you share a lot of things online, you may be making things visible and thinking that you know what you've shared or exposed, but what you don't necessarily know is who's choosing to look at what and under what parameters. So how things are becoming visible and for whom, and who does that serve, and how might that at some point become visible in a way that you hadn't anticipated, let's say. So kind of different data sets kind of coming to light in different ways. But it was also this sense of it being, in this project I employed a ghostwriter to write my memoir, my autobiography, based only on my digital footprint and on the things that they found on me online. And I was kind of, one of the things that I was interested in within it was this idea of the privilege almost of being read by a human when you don't know, especially when it comes to your digital data and things that are present in your digital footprint, let's say. Most of that is being read by non-human agencies who may be selecting and again kind of choosing what parameters they look at you with and become visible with in ways that are completely beyond your understanding. And I'd thought about who is it that is invisible to power, and how that I mean, this whole project is a kind of gesture of almost making yourself hyper visible. So kind of almost acting out in a slightly parodic way the imperative that you could say of kind of neoliberal capital and of fully mediated network life, to constantly share yourself and have your information accessible and be visible, let's say, to the state and to various institutions, whether they be government or Amazon or YouTube or Facebook or whatever, and interlockingly. So there's that gesture of kind of making that very visible, but I suppose now I've lost my train of thought.
But you seem to have had a shift, I mean,
Yeah.
in our discussions, from wanting to endorse visibility or exposure as politically useful, and now towards wanting to question the use of visibility. And I'm just wondering why that is, or what sort of prompted that shift, or what the shift is. Is that too general a question?
No.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think in many ways this is kind of what I've really been moving towards over the past year or so is, and which I haven't necessarily still worked out, but what is it that's lost when making something visible? And I think you put it well, which is this sense that it rigidifies or solidifies knowledge. So even in the case of the female fool, when you're using something like parody or kind of making stereotypes visible, you're also constructing the object of your critique. And, in that sense, you're also kind of constructing the stereotypes and assuming them to be something solid. And I think I've got a quote here that I took from the Kosowski-Sedgwick essay. Actually, this one's quite a good one, because this is, we talked about this a bit before as well. This is from an essay called Smuggling by Irene Revell. And as she says there's a serious problem here, which is to do with unveiling, unravelling, exposing and laying bare, as there is an assumption that meaning is imminent. So again, this is kind of what we've been saying, that it's always already there and precedes its uncovering. So
that kind of knowingness,
and again, which can quite often just, first of all, it assumes that meaning is imminent, that it just needs to be uncovered. It exists out there prior to its representation. It's just something which is kind of almost immutable and just needs to be discovered. And of course, there's a link between that and ideas of the performativity of identity and of gender. So rather than assuming that there is an identity or there is a gender which exists prior to its representation, there's a sense that knowledge is also performative. Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of that's why I started to feel uncomfortable with this idea of artists making claims, particularly when it comes to things like surveillance and art, dealing with things like that. That there was this making visible as if it was neutral As if, as an artist, you could stand outside that act of making visible without actually making anew and without bringing your own subject position into it. Because, of course, each person is going to make something visible in a completely different way. It's not neutral.
Exactly. And in claiming this sort of neutrality, you might be reproducing the very forms of power and actually partaking in them, the very forms of power that you're wanting to dissent against. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
And I think one of the other things that I mentioned when we were talking about the problems of visibility was an essay called Broken Symmetries by Peggy Phelan from her book Unmarked. And I think she has some very interesting thoughts on why the assumption that disenfranchised communities might benefit from seeing their members within the representational field, so gaining greater visibility. For example, in the case that she's looking at, racial minorities, it's not such an implicitly good thing. I mean, implicit within that argument are several presumptions which bear a degree of scrutiny, and I'll read out what she says. That identities are visibly marked, so the resemblance between, here's her example, the African American on the television and the African American in the street helps the observer see they are members of the same community, reading physical resemblance as a way of identifying community. Number 2, that the relationship between representation and identity is linear and smoothly mimetic. What one sees is who one is. And if one's mimetic likeness is not represented, that one is not addressed. And lastly, that increased visibility equals increased power. And so those sorts of assumptions implicit in the power of visibility, in rendering visible, are obviously deeply problematic. What happens when one's identity cannot be visibly registered, or the visible registering of one's identity limits one or forces one to identify in all sorts of ways which one wouldn't choose, or that the idea that increased visibility equals increased power, it might also mean assimilation or complicity, or all of those other problems. So I think, just some of that resonates with what you're...
And I mean, and Cedric actually says something about that on the last point of actually the idea of becoming more visible is often used by power, let's say, as a tactic in itself, which is to do with kind of making examples of certain types of bodies of people in order to kind of further the sense that they are in power, or that there is this kind of order. But I was also thinking about something I'd written about a little bit last year, which was only slightly, but about the idea of the normcore, which kind of was going around at some point. And I remember one of the critiques of that being that the whole idea of normcore and almost kind of not standing out and almost like a kind of sameness was again a privilege afforded only to those who could just blend in and disappear, and actually there are many people who can't for whatever reason, basically because they don't fit into what is a normative person, or what is the dominant, let's say. So again, that even in a kind of it's something as kind of flippant as a fashion meme, which did spread though and kind of had a certain like people kind of understood it, that even within that there's this question of how visibility relates to power, I think is still it's still kind of being played out. And I don't know, the other thing that I suppose I found with myself was that with this idea of uncovering and exposing, that maybe as an artist you can sometimes reach a little bit of a block, because it's like you don't want to, well, this is how I felt anyway, is that you want to be making something anew in some way and not just kind of critiquing what's there. And I thought maybe I should just talk a little bit about how this relates to the dark archive, which I mentioned.
I was going to ask you about that. What is a dark archive?
Because I have to say, this is very early. I wouldn't normally show this at this early stage.
This is the research that you're engaging in whilst you're here. Yeah.
Which again comes, I became interested in kind of, instead of looking at exposure and illumination as forms of creating meaning and, again, uncovering exposure, this sense of which is quite a light way of looking at how meaning is created, and started looking at the idea of, again, what lies under visibility, what's kind of unintelligible, and whether that had a certain agency or a certain interest to kind of explore. So this is kind of what I've been working with for the past few months. But just recently, just from being here, I came across the idea of, first of all, an invisible archive and then a dark archive. So again, it's interesting how the dark and invisible have been kind of put together, and maybe I'm even doing it too as I'm speaking when they're not the same thing, I guess. But so there doesn't seem to be one definition of a dark archive, so I'm kind of like picking freely for the various things that came up. But here's a few of them on the screen. So its purpose is to function as a repository for information that can be used as a failsafe during disaster recovery. So I was kind of interested in this as well because I've been reading a lot more around the Anthropocene and kind of like some post-apocalyptic type of scenario. So there is this sense, there is this kind of temporal dimension to it as well, of kind of pushing it, but making it it's a kind of speculative future where you don't know how this archive will be read or understood, or whether it will be intelligible to whoever was to find it in the future. You know, maybe not, or maybe the ways that it would be intelligible would create new meanings in a way that can't necessarily be predicted. So also the access to the data is either limited to a set few individuals or completely restricted to all. So it's like it exists as an archive, but it's inaccessible, and particularly that it's not public. So there's something there about, hence the term invisible. That it kind of made me think of the whole like Donald Rumsfeld, like, you know, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but the known unknowns and the So I think this counts as a unknown known. I don't know. I read the analogy somewhere. It's definitely, you know, it works out somewhere there. But so also it's a secret place for storing archival material with restricted user access. So again, restrictions, archival information that is used not for public access. And then this bit where it says serves as a fail-safe copy of a light archive. So you see that there is this kind of other that it's relating to. And it need not be a fully operational copy of an information system, rather just the content behind the information system. So I was kind of interested in that because I've been working for years. To me, that sounds like it's talking about metadata. So the things which relate to the materials rather than the materials itself, because you might not be able to have an exact copy of the archive, but you can have an exact copy of all the holders, you know, all of the metadata relating to it. So the, you know, the time, the place, its provenance, title.
I have a couple of questions. One, I do want to return a little bit to the uses of unintelligibility, because I think they're maybe potentially not so useful. But I want, on a purely practical note, how do you research or work with an archive you can't access or don't know is there? What do you do with it? Yeah. Well, what I was. How are you going to use this?
So what I've been doing with this idea was I've been uploading all of my photos to the new Google photo service, which again there's all kinds of stuff around that as to why is it free? Well, there's clearly something that. There's some exchange going on there. I think it's to do with the way that they're learning about how people title and use photos, and obviously pattern recognition in terms of you know, improving their own algorithms for identifying images and what's within images. So, for example, if you put in selfie, it tells you it identifies for itself. So and here you go with beaches as well. So I was kind of wondering how I could work with this idea of the dark archive or the invisible archive, and I began to think about what about all the things that almost made it into the set of beaches or selfies or cats or whatever, but didn't quite for whatever reason. And that's actually something that's quite hard to work out, but unless you go through all your thousands of photos and go, hey, that was a selfie, why isn't it in that folder? So I started to think about what about speculating on what's missing and why. And what I've done is I've put a call out and invited writers of all types, so I've tried to kind of be quite broad about that, to speculate on a missing set of media. So they have to choose a keyword to search my archive with, and then they're given a link to it. So if they searched with beaches, they would get this. And so rather than uncovering something, they're kind of being asked to fabricate something, essentially. And of course, it would be completely different depending who the writer is, and it would in many ways would reflect their own interests, because they're going to be complete strangers, and quite a few of the people I'm in conversation with are not living on the other side of the world, so they'll be bringing their own particularities of context to it. So they're not going to be illuminating a hidden archive, but kind of that's kind of what I was thinking about with the dark archive. That it's something that it's the contents that can't be retrieved, or which haven't been retrieved, can't be located, somehow have slipped beneath the radar of that parameter. So, you know, beaches or selfie, and in some way they're in the archive, but they can't be reached for whatever reason. So they're not being made public, and yeah. So that was my thinking with the project. This is obviously very early days. Like, I only sent the call out a few days ago, so we'll see where it goes. But that kind of explains the. And just to say, I mean, one of the other things in terms of this sense of illuminating versus kind of something being made anew is that Google also seems to, it just automatically creates things from my archive. And it's funny because, so this actually, the image on the right, well, the GIF, I guess, the animation, this was from the time when I was researching the female fool. So it's a T-shirt with the nipples cut out. And this was my Facebook profile picture for International Women's Day, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So, but yeah, I was kind of looking at, and it's constantly creating these because I've put so many images up there. And there's this sense in which, like, is it creating something itself out of what's there, or is it illuminating something which I just hadn't seen and kind of making it visible to me? And so I've become kind of quite fascinated just looking at all the stuff that it brings up. But yeah, so the job that I'm kind of briefing the writers to do is to speculate on and basically imagine their own archive out of mine.
I'm interested in your interest in unintelligibility, because I suppose one of the things that I find problematic about things to unintelligibility, to wanting to kind of resist assimilation by not making oneself understandable, by rejecting forms of identification, is, you know, that if a dominant culture has no investment in recognising the minority and their claims, you know, then isn't that simply ratifying, you know, to kind of refuse to participate, isn't that simply ratifying that dominant culture's disinterest?
So in a sense, we're still needing, it's like still needing validation from somewhere, and in order, so even if what you're seeking validation for is unintelligibility, that's still a form of legibility, actually, of being able to be read, and like, yes, that counts.
We might think about somebody like that we have discussed, which is Jose Munoz, is disidentification. So he talks very, very early on in his book about 3 models for thinking about identification, or ways in which minoritarian subjects might find a place for themselves within a dominant culture. One of those might be to identify with that dominant culture, to all intents and purposes assimilate oneself within whatever that dominant culture is. The other would be to counter-identify, to simply reject the values of that culture, the ways of identifying. That may be unlivable for some. You know, that in order to function, one needs to participate in, you know, to pass as within a normative gender, to pass within a certain class culture in order to simply survive. But the third might be something called disidentification, which is the idea that one might take up the materials offered by a dominant culture and reformulate them in a more livable way. So it's not simply but also in a way that creates a kind of it's not some kind of halfway house between dissent and assimilation, but actually it is to invest with those things with meanings anew, and to value precisely, and to accord value to demonstrate the value of that which has been rejected, but and so it's a kind of interesting kind of creative practice. He calls it world making.
And did he see a real agency in that?
Absolutely, but as an alternative to a kind of agency drawn from critique, drawn from simply attacking or that dominant culture, and therefore remaining in opposition to it, you know, remaining defined by the thing that you're opposing, that I am queer in as much as I'm against this
Yeah.
model of subjectivity, that actually it might be a kind of an invented practice.
And you know, I was when reading Munoz and also Sedgwick, and I don't know if this is just maybe from an earlier moment, but I wondered what you thought about this. That there's quite a lot of mention of dominant culture, and which and marginal culture, and I just wondered what your like maybe what the relationship of stupidity is to that, or even if you think that, because I mean, like the Disidentifications was written in like late 90s, is the idea of dominant culture does it still hold water? I mean,
I
know that's a bit.
What culture you're referring to,
I know.
and what the criteria are. I mean, that's very broad.
Yeah.
And in terms of the relationship of stupidity to dominant or minoritarian cultures, that's a very interesting one. Because on the one hand, the accusation of stupidity has been one of the most habitual tools within which minoritarian cultures or the other, for example, has their speech undermined. You know, that women are called stupid, faggots are merely silly, you know, or there's this view of I don't know, the racialized subject or the classed subject as being unintelligent. So it becomes one way in which it's a very powerful tool for the undermining of speech, because of course any attempt one makes to speak out against it will simply be dismissed as not worth listening to. So the accusation of a lack of intelligence or of stupidity is a very powerful tool. On the other hand, stupidity, as I was saying, is not simply opposed to intelligence, and it's also not, you couldn't simply say that it describes the other, because of course there are perfectly dominant, perfectly socially acceptable forms of stupidity. I mean, fascism is a form of stupidity, a kind of refusal of understanding that held sway. It was the dominant culture of a certain society, and so I think this idea that stupidity is a minoritarian concern, or that stupidity
that's kind of what I was going to say. Is it almost a tactic of the marginal? That's kind of what I was wondering. I mean, I guess anything could be, but is that maybe how you'd thought of it at some point, or?
No, I mean, stupidity is infinite and it's everywhere. It's all sides of the, and in fact, one of the interesting things, for example, that the exhibition attempts to do is to show that there might be, certain forms of, that there might be one form of stupidity that is about producing understandings that are reductive, and other forms of stupidity that might be about not understanding, and that they might fall on both sides of the kind of class divide, on all sides of kind of whether one belongs to kind of the centre or the margins. I think perhaps one thing that I had been interested in was the ways in which certain queer artists had tried to embrace silliness, irreverence, the kind of trashy and low, precisely in order to kind of cast off received wisdom, off, but actually what the limits of that might be. So the fact that simply embracing stupidity, as I said, you can't embrace stupidity as a form of agency because it becomes a form of cleverness. That it might. But also, I think. I've lost my train of thought.
Do you know what I was? Because I remember thinking this I went to see the exhibition at the opening, so it was quite busy. But from what I saw of it, I also got the sense that it was also about the stupefying. And I don't know there's a stupid and there's stupidity, but there's also the stupefying in the sense of the kind of image overload, and maybe in that way that brings it back to some of the kind of my like. Tech related kind of that sense of that there's the stupefying effect of living in a fully media saturated world.
Absolutely.
And is that a thing of does it make people stupid, or what's the artist trying to do? Are they trying to recreate that feeling of overload and the stupefying effect? Or anyway, so just to finish, I guess.
There are lots of very different ways in which artists use stupefaction. I mean, one of the ways that I think that might that I'm interested in would be somebody like Clooney Reed's.
That's what I was thinking of.
Clooney Reed's work, In Pursuit of the Liquid, is sort of a 4-screen installation, but in the show it's a 2-screen one with a sort of series of GIFs or screen grabs that are almost strobed at their viewer. And it was, I was thinking about the ways, and then normally GIFs of kind of big-titted women, of kind of images of parodic femininity, and I was interested in thinking through, what do you do when you are, a minoritarian subject whose speech is disavowed, when you are sidelined as stupid? How do you speak out against that? One of the ways in which you might do that is to kind of work on and through stupidity, to kind of push it further, if you like, and rather than simply trying to kind of parody these images or to critique them or undermine them, she pushes them further using the kind of stupefying effects until they lose their meaning and they lose their coherence and they kind of deform visually in front of your eyes. And so they sort of lose some of their kind of purchase of this way, or the image itself becomes untethered from any kind of object and allows itself to kind of float rather freely. And so that was one way in which she might use that.
I don't know, if just while you were talking, it made me think of the kind of flicker films of the, I can't believe I've forgotten who some of the key artists are, but Sam knows at the back, even though he's working. But yeah, the types of filmmaking where it would just be like really, really intense colour and image, and it would actually produce a physical effect in the viewer. It's quite kind of sickening almost.
I mean, there is a theoretical precedent for this, which would be somebody like, something like Deleuze or Foucault's engagement with stupidity. So Foucault has a really interesting essay on Deleuze, but also on Warhol, and talks about how in Warhol everything's reduced to the same. There's an encounter, so there's a stupefaction at work there, where all difference is reduced to sameness. And this reduction to sameness that might allow other modalities of difference to emerge. So when all Coca-Cola bottles are the same, the differences, the kind of the distinctions that hold sway in a particular symbolic order, a particular discourse, fall away if one fails to understand, it's all the same to me. I fail to see the distinction, I'm unable to see the difference. That might make, in that encounter, in that receding from given meaning or given distinctions, given understandings, new forms of difference might be allowed to emerge. And that's one of the kind of the thoughts about the kind of ways in which that kind of stupefaction might occur, that it might be, if you are stupefied by something, you might be having an encounter with an otherness that you cannot assimilate, then it might be, that it might be a kind of a failure of understanding that, a stupefaction, I don't understand, I don't get it, I'm shocked out of an ability to master the object I'm encountering, and that might force new and other forms of articulation, it might release one. So, another example of that might be in a kind of shocking rudeness. A number of the works in there are rather aggressive and shock one, they provoke one, and that kind of offence, but also that kind that receding from the encounter. I don't know how to quantify this, and I also don't know how to react to this. Might force new forms of ethical relation, new forms of articulation. With that's one way in which that kind of ethical encounter with a kind of with something that stupefies, which renders one inarticulate, which cannot simply, it stupefies you because you cannot master it, you cannot assimilate it.
I think just before we go to questions, I was thinking that in a sense that relates to a lot of my interest working with different types of data and capture and quantification, is that in a sense it's this thing of what can't be quantified. Maybe that's also my interest, and to trying to work out what's in a regime where everything is evaluated, valorized, everything is quantified and somehow put to use and instrumentalized. Is there something which kind of falls outside of that and creates a moment of that maybe can't be assimilated, can't be put back into creating value at some point? And so maybe that's a connection.
Shall we go to questions, because we've sort of ranged really madly? Does anybody have anything?
I'm intrigued as to whether or not you've actually talked about, Erica, what I would see as a sort of almost adopting a sort of dumb strategy.
Mhm.
A lot of your work is in its sort of repetition, and it's what potential might that hold in the face of this very articulate technicity, perhaps, from which it's playing within, but also Paul picking up on what you said recently, with beautifully that repetition in difference. Especially in difference and repetition with Deleuze and that the stupidity of the act. I think there's something there that is integral to what you're both saying that I wonder if you could speak a bit more about.
Do you want to?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, like in a lot of my work, there is a dumbness. There is an almost kind of almost trying to work out what the internal logic of something is and playing it out to its extreme in some sense, which has that's a kind of humorous strategy, which it's kind of almost like, is this what's expected of me? Okay, I'll just follow the law blindly and carry it out right to its end. And there's a kind of dumbness in that, particularly when, as in a lot of my projects, like the one I was saying before, like Life in AdWords, there's a lot of repetition. So there's also that sense of like you're failing to learn. You're carrying out whatever this thing is every day, and you're just doing the same thing over and over again. I mean, there's a dumbness almost in that, the inability or the kind of feigned inability to learn from it. But I don't know, was there something else you were thinking? Because I mean, that's definitely, that's definitely within my work.
This idea of disidentification through Munoz text, I thought was the closest that you came to it, if you like, because of using that code for other purposes as well, which I think this is another angle on top of that.
There's also over-identification, because I was actually on a panel earlier this year that was called disidentification, and I hadn't come across Munoz's text, unfortunately, otherwise I would have brought it up. But I was talking about, because there's like misidentification, disidentification, and I was talking at the time about kind of over-identification and a type of, which has also been called things like a kind of complicit antagonism or complicit activism. So basically over-identifying with whatever is the imperative that is kind of known within culture or within a particular social regime, but isn't necessarily spoken out loud. So it's kind of almost over-identifying with it, with the sense that it then becomes visible. So that word again.
You wanted to ask me about difference and repetition? Or
I thought what you said when we were, sorry, I have to, this is slightly, you said this, you mentioned and I think you may have picked up on it already in the Foucault and mentioned it already, but I was wondering if you could say anything more about that repetitious sort of aspect, which is about the stupidity of that act, where he goes with that, because I thought that was really interesting.
Sure. Deleuze uses an almost kind of Flaubertian definition of stupidity, which would be to do with the cliche, with the idea of a kind of preformed thought that is applied without the rigour of original thinking, and expands that really to talk about the kind of citationality of all meaning. That, in order for us to be understood, one has to articulate one's thoughts within a language which is commonly understood, and that is citational, and therefore one's thoughts, whatever thinking one engages in, is killed almost immediately in its articulation by being set within essentially a preformed thought. And so that there's, all thinking is subject to its denaturalization into stupidity at the moment it is articulated. But so that's one kind of strain of it, and the other one being that and so the cliche is a kind of form of repetition, But one of his arguments is that through that you might sort of almost work on and through stupidity, that there might be forms of repetition, that reduce given distinctions, the kind of to a kind of sameness. That this understanding of that a distinction within a kind of semiotic system is only ever a kind of the difference between, oh goodness, it's very involved, but it's about
I just did something
how
really
I can
geeky as well.
how can unpack the notion of transcendental stupidity in Deleuze's work in a kind of soundbite for you, but yeah.
Well, if there's a sort of
Yeah.
contingency of the text that comes into play through its repetition and also through its code that's repeated and adopted, and over-identification seems to be a repetitiousness that then leads to utter contingency in its,
Mhm.
you know, in its effect. Like,
Well,
because
yeah.
when you begin to question what is going to happen next,
Mhm.
this then becomes potentially radically open.
But I think it's also, I mean, I remember first coming across like Dara Birnbaum talking about technology transformation, Wonder Woman, in which she collected lots of clips of the moment where Wonder Woman transforms, and you know there's the kind of explosion. So it's like a 70s or 80s TV series. Sorry, I should know there. But she described it as, you know, through formal repetition that the kind of underlying logic is exposed. Or I can't remember her exact, but she definitely used repetition of a formal trope. So I think, you know, that's, again, it's a long-standing idea that thereby, you know, you're making the code visible, which is the ideas of kind of feminine agency within TV culture. So I also just did something really geeky while you were talking and looked up in my Evernotes the word citation, because I know that I used it in my thesis somewhere, and I've got a Derrida quote of every act is itself a recitation, the citing of a prior chain of acts which are implied in the present act and which perpetually drain any present act of its presentness. But somebody else, Marvin Carlson, described it as an argument that it's only by virtue of citation or what he calls iterability that performative utterances can succeed. So in the sense that even a performative utterance like I now proclaim you man and wife, which is the example they give, it only works because it exists in culture. It's been ratified by law or by existing culture to have that meaning.
But I mean that then therefore limits the kind of possibilities for the articulation of subjectivity if it always has to be articulated within a definition that has a history, that is citational, exactly. that can be held in common. And so I think Deleuze is trying to think of forms of difference that are not based on given forms of difference. So the distinction between two definitions as being one way in which definition is established between self and other, between one term and another in a kind of semiotic system, that is a form of difference that is actually in a weird way the same in as much as it is a form of difference between two likes, two things within the same system. And he wants to argue for forms of difference that are not defined by what is already assumed or known, what is already, you know, a form of difference that steps outside of the distinctions within that kind of, you know, within a dominant discourse way of thinking. Should we talk? Yeah. Should we have another question?
Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering how you think about the sort of transcendental or transgressive stupidity in relation to technology, because especially with artists dealing with the internet, there's to a degree there's like a lacking of technological literacy, I guess. I think that's just true across the board. And it seems like the figure that emerges, at least for me, in the truly transcendentally stupid act on the internet is the troll, which is often like a combination of incredible technological proficiency and like utterly stupid misuse, and which is in itself like a perfectly transgressive and, you know, and with anonymous and this kind of idea of being completely it's like perfect rhizomatic transgression within a structure which is supposed to be controlling, but is also fundamentally rhizomatic.
Goodness, I mean, I have to say that my stupidity is that I'm a bit of a Luddite. So that's where we sort of part ways in terms of I think the kind of the queer and feminist politics is where we meet, the question of the technological is where I depart. I mean, the one thing that I would say is that the troll, I think, would fit precisely within that kind of model of a transgressive stupidity, and that's something that I'm not particularly interested in. One of the things in the exhibition that I was very careful not to do was, to include the work of the bad boy artist, somebody like, Paul McCarthy or others who, say in his work Painter might be on the one hand, engaging in a kind of a playing dumb that attempts to undermine the figure of the genius artist, but who then draws strength precisely from that playing dumb to kind of position himself as some sort of radical, of some kind of voice of, and that actually becomes another form of masculine power, another claim to knowledge, a claim to his insight and his mastery and his transgressive potency, if you like, and that actually that form of knowingness, that kind of self-certitude over his own power and value, claims a kind of coherency for himself as a subject that I would want to undermine. He thinks he's being clever in order to do that, and in doing so occupies the same kind of authority that he would want to be undermining and getting away from, and so it's a gesture that almost eats itself. And that actually, if you were really to take seriously the lessons of stupidity, the anti-authoritarian, the anti-identitarian lessons of stupidity, you would want to find a model of art making that assumes almost permanent parabasis, this idea of a kind of irony of understanding that can never resolve itself, that one can never occupy the position of knowledge because any attempt to do so would automatically undermine itself by being too reductive, too limiting, or too authoritarian. That actually you would attempt to highlight that irony and that impossibility of resolution. And I don't think that the troll figure who wants to catch others out, or a Paul McCarthy who wants to transgress and therefore to position himself as radically outside of, I don't think that does that. I think it's too resolved.
And what I just want to say quite prosaically, trolls, and maybe this links back to the idea of stupidity in terms of a marginal culture and a dominant culture, is that quite often the people that they attack and really make life extremely miserable and difficult for are what could be considered minoritarian and marginal culture. So quite often black women are really, really harassed by online trolls, and of course protected by anonymity. So they're using their actual intelligence, extreme intelligence of knowing how to actually put all of that into place in order to attack people who have already been maybe with less agency in the dominant culture. So I don't know, is that kind of what you were?
I suppose I was thinking of like an ideal troll, like a sort of Diogenes kind of troll, rather than the actual troll, which is more like a kind of like mass libertarian, reactionary sort of vibe that more or less reflects what mass culture generally is. One edge of it can be, but there is the opposite of that as well. There are less bad trolls.
It makes me think of Nicholson Baker's book, The Fermata, which is all about a guy who discovers he has the talent to stop time, an amazing thing to be able to do, to step out of time, but he only uses it to look up women's skirts. And it would seem to me that you could do better things than trolling. To use all of that technological knowledge simply to do that.
we're being given the sign for. So unless anybody has got something they really need to add in there. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Keep the discussion in the break
Yeah.
now, so please, keep.
We'll just keep talking.
Erica and Paul. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
right? Oh, right, cheers. Cup of tea as well. My goodness, lining them up. Yeah, but this is the talk. It's just me drinking loads of stuff. As many things as possible.
So yeah, thanks again to Erica and Paul for a really fascinating conversation. It's very exciting, and I hope your discussion will continue in the future. Surely made us think a lot here in the audience and in our break. So thanks a lot. We will continue now with James Riley with your presentation, Ghost Noise. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to stand, I think, for this. Am I loud enough? Is that causing interference? Okay, great. Well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming. My name is James. I'm Fellow of English at Gurnt College in Cambridge. Thanks to Lotte for putting this together and inviting me to do this. Thanks for Donna also for the same. Thanks also to Paul for a really engaging conversation last week and your contact. Thanks to Evie also for some of the images and her PowerPoint assistance. Anyway, okay, so we'll see how this goes. As ever, this is a talk which is based on some research that I'm currently doing. I'm more than happy to talk about my research, but I think certainly listening to the excellent presentation that we just had then, I think there might be points of intersection which we'd be able to pick up on. Okay, so let's get going then. So this is a talk called Ghost Noise. And here's our starting point. 1968, London's Institute of Contemporary Arts played host to the now famous show, I'm sure lots of people know this, Cybernetic Serendipity, an exhibition exploring and demonstrating some of the relationships between technology and creativity. And amongst the numerous examples of computer art and interactive sculpture, there was a piece by Hugh Riddle and Anthony Pritchett called Sidebands 1968. Now, Sidebands was a series of images taken from an oscilloscopic sequence. The artist had fed a series of harmonically related sine waves into a cathode ray tube and then proceeded to alter the frequency ratio in order to create a range of protean pulsating graphic forms. This was, according to the artists, an elaboration of the Lissajous technique that's familiar to various forms of frequency measurement. However, by using high-frequency sideband signals, essentially radio waves that parallel a carrier frequency, Riddle and Pritchett were able to create the effect that you see there, not just of intersecting lines, but of textured intersecting surfaces. In the catalogue for the exhibition, Riddle and Pritchett note that the images have been designed as part of a proposed title sequence for Out of the Unknown, a BBC Two television programme. And Out of the Unknown was an anthology series that ran between 1965 and 1971, presenting hour-long adaptations of stories by J.G. Ballard, Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov, amongst lots of others. Despite Riddle and Pritchett offering what was, in effect, an extremely cost-effective form of animation, the BBC ultimately commissioned an alternative title sequence from Bernard Lodge, he of Doctor Who fame. With its central image that you can just about see there, central image of the sequence, and there's Doctor Who just for your reference, and that's probably a better image of it. This central image of a human form floating, possibly falling through space. Lodge's sequence was more figurative, but utilised effects not unrelated to sidebands. What's been described stylistically as soul bass on acid was achieved through a combination of slit-scan photography and dissonant moire patterns. Now then, when seen as part of the Cybernetic Serendipity exhibition, Sidebands certainly does highlight the link between creativity and technology. What began as a technical exercise for Riddle and Pritchett revealed, by their own admission, unexpected graphic properties even at the testing stage, and thus yielded results independent of their original commission. However, beyond this exhibition brief to bridge information theory and contemporary art, the proximity of sidebands to Out of the Unknown and, spiritually, to Doctor Who points to a pre-existent bridge operating in the 1960s and the 1970s, that between cybernetics, broadly understood, and various forms of popular media such as science fiction and horror. Thinking here in relation to that last example, particularly of things like Nigel Neal's The Stone Tape from 1972. A second associated point that I think is possibly of more relevance to today's gathering is the interplay that sidebands establishes between information and aesthetics. That's to say, the work is essentially an analogue representation of electronic interference. The graphics arise as a result, as they say, of harmonically related sine waves being drawn into a position of dissonance with each other. This frequency shift results in a distortion of the wave pattern, but one that's perceived by the artist to be productive, aesthetically pleasing, if not beautiful. And as they state there, it's an interesting experience to work with an electronic sequence in such a subjective way, often exploring conditions that would be treated as faults in, for instance, industrial systems. In cybernetics terms then, sidebands is a work comprised and born out of noise. That which the cybernetic serendipity catalogue classed, as you can see there, as any undesirable signal interfering with the transmission of a message, usually random. Now, whilst they would agree with random, Riddle and Pritchett would likely quibble that it was undesirable. And such a position would not be at odds conceptually with the status of noise within cybernetics. Offered as the study of control and communication, cybernetics, particularly via Norbert Wiener, understands noise in purely quantitative terms. When theorising communicative efficiency, noise is posited as anything that arrives as part of a message that was not there when the message was first sent out. Noise is thus excess information, that which is accumulated in transit. It is the voice of the channel rather than the voice of the speaker. Whether the effect of this presence is to distort or to amplify a given signal, the message that contains noise carries more information than that which does not. Now, this is an idea which informs my own work in literary studies. That's to say, I see literature as a form of noise. By this, I mean rather than taking the word to mean writing deemed to hold high cultural and social status, that which labels the words and thoughts typically of great men, I see it as a label for a particular kind of writing. Literature describes writing which exploits the ambiguity and fluidity of language, the drifts and elisions that other forms of written communication would seek to compress. Hence, when speaking about literary meaning, about depth, about the invitation to reread, we're describing a type of writing that conveys meaning and significance in excess of its ostensible content. Some authors exploit this, some readers exploit this. Either way, literature, seen as a particular incarnation of a particular communications technology, is not an open channel. It is one that encodes and adds to the messages sent through it. I think this is particularly the case as regards poetry. Poetry, from poesis, broadly understood as making, is an artifact constructed out of the instruments of language. In essence, I see poetry as inefficient communication because it works against the instrumental role of writing, a symbolic technology that preserves words in the absence of the speaker. I see the difference then between writing and poetry in terms of the difference between using a mobile phone to call your mate in the other room and getting a box of mobile phones and making them into a sculpture. Poetry is thus akin to a phone line awash with noise and static, but it's precisely all of these clicks, buzzes, hisses that make the text interesting and, crucially, give it a life beyond the design and the intention of the sender. Hence, when reading poetry, I think we should be encouraged to listen to the noise rather than trying to neutralize it. Now, this take is not intended to be purely analogical, an importation of convenient metaphors from a parallel discourse. Rather, I think that the model of noise that emerges from cybernetics is a key concept in understanding how communication works and, more specifically, how communication yields knowledge. As thinkers like Gordon Pask highlight, we learn through conversation, through processes and loops of feedback, adjustment, interaction, drift and modification. Within this matrix, noise is that which bridges the gap between the un and the known, as it is either that which is negotiated or else introduced to prompt productive difference. But of course, this is not a new idea. Okay? The proximity between noise and knowledge has an enormous cultural history, and as a heuristic principle, that which aids teaching and prompts learning, it underpins all kinds of encounters. So we need an example then here, don't we? And preferably an extreme example. Take a look at what I'm going to show you now and also listen to it. Okay. All right, so what you just saw there was one of a series of videos posted on YouTube purporting to record loud aerial noises of indeterminate origin. And these videos have appeared consistently since 2008 from a number of places around the world. And the clip we've just seen is one of the most widely circulated of these videos, and it originates from Canada. Now, various geophysical explanations have been posited as a source of the sound, as has the ongoing work of the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Programme, or HARP. Equally, though, these clips have been offered as recordings of the angelic trumpets, in which the Book of Revelations follow the apocalyptic opening of the seventh seal. Either way, this surely is a signal that comes out of the unknown and exists as that which is paranormal, beside, against, contrary to one's normal expectations. Now, whatever the root cause, we could say that on a very basic level, this particular encounter with the unknown is productive insofar as it galvanizes the work of thought as a means to explain it. The noise demands an answer. We could say stupefying it to a certain degree, connecting with the previous talk. It prompts that question precisely, what is it? To use a literary term, this quiet suburb in British Columbia has been radically defamiliarized, made strange by the enunciation of this sound. Now, all of these videos feature people looking out of their houses, which I think is symbolically telling, as the moment is precisely uncanny or unhomely. The noise has caused the familiar to become unfamiliar, and the witnesses of this anomaly are then tasked with the productive need to generate an appropriate, accommodating, and explanatory framework. Now, T.S. Eliot here, I think, was thinking about noise in similar terms when he was writing The Wasteland, a poem that, amongst many other questions, asks, what is this sound high in the air? The final published version from 1922 concludes with a section called What the Thunder Said, a reference to the Hindu fable whereby gods, men and demons entreated the soul of the universe to speak. Communicating as thunder, the response is a single booming syllable, da. Each of the groups interpret this sound as a different word, data, diadvam, damyata, which the Wasteland renders as give, sympathize, control. In essence, this fable describes the delivery of commandments, but what seems to interest Eliot is the manner in which it presents received wisdom as the product of misinterpretation. The knowledge imparted is grounded in ambiguity, where one might expect to find the clarity of the divine word, and again, quoting the previous presentation, an immanent meaning that precedes its uncovering. One finds instead a message subject to drift. One finds a message that's not the same when it arrives as when it was sent out. A message that's very much involved in the act of dissemination. We might also consider here the Native American myth of the thunderbird. A bird of monstrous size that causes thunder when it flies, the creature is variously offered as a vengeful spirit, an intermediary between gods and men, as well as a harbinger announcing future events. In this respect, it's monstrous in the literal sense of portentous. According to the various myths associated with the Winnebago tribe, a man who has a vision of a thunderbird during a solitary fast will become a war chief. As with Eliot's image, the reception of resounding noise is highly significant and charged with meaning. The recent earth noises seem to be part of this continuum. Whether they're the horns of angels or the grind of tectonic plates, as with the speaking thunder and the flight of the thunderbird, they're all big bangs. In this mythic schema, thunderous noise is cosmogenetic. It's the sound of creation. Now then, if this archetype is so extensive, as my brief and obviously admittedly generalised survey possibly suggests, and if ambiguity has such a pervasive operational role in communication, then why does noise maintain such a conceptual link to that which is somehow disturbing, negative, and undesirable? Why does its popular representation and use veer towards the unsettling territory of out of the unknown? I think this has to do with the role that noise plays, not so much in the act of communication, but in the process of mediation, its position as something that exists within a given medium. Consider, if you will, the fate of the traditional English folk song Cherry Ripe by Robert Herrick and Edward Horne. It's a familiar enough tune based allegedly on the calls of street traders. It's a type of thing that one might expect to find in all kinds of polite chamber music contexts of the 18th and 19th centuries. It is a favourite song. But for fans of classic horror movies, it has a different set of associations. In Jacques Tourneur's Night of the Demon from 1957, it's used by the medium, Mr. Meek, there, to induce a trance during the film's séance scene. Once lulled into this state by the familiar refrain, Mr. Meek begins to channel the deceased Professor Harrington, who, in a spectacularly uncanny moment, then proceeds to issue a warning to his niece who's present at the séance. In this scene, Tourneur uses the pleasant ditty as a kind of counterpoint. Cherry Ripe reeks of inoffensive afternoon teas, English interiors, and life measured out in coffee spoons. It seems to fit with the harmless eccentricity that we initially expect of the séance scene. But in so doing, it then renders the success of Meek's mediumship and Harrington's dire warning all the more chilling, precisely because it's so unexpected. Cherry Ripe does not on its own automatically connote ghostly communication, at least not until it started turning up on stray shortwave radio frequencies accompanied by eerie, synthesized voices of men, women, and children. Listen to this. All right. Now then, that was a recording of a so-called numbers station, what's been described as mysterious shortwave radio stations of uncertain origin. These broadcasts have been picked up by radio hams for decades, and they're rumoured to have been circulating since the very early days of radio. The general consensus is that this combination of number sequences and interval signals, the musical bars you heard there, works as a means of communicating messages to undercover agents in the field. They're seen as a kind of cryptographic switchboard. In this instance, cherry ripe is being used as a frequency identifier between the code broadcasts. Now, there is another station that provided information in a similar format, but made use of another English folk song, the Lincolnshire Poacher. From what's been gathered by archivists and enthusiasts so far, it's surmised that these stations were being operated by MI6. Cherry Ripe was apparently broadcast from Australia, while the Lincolnshire Poacher was rumoured to come somewhere from Cyprus. Both ceased broadcasting in 2008 and 9, a date that surely is coincidental with the emergence of the Earth noise at the same time. Now then, what have these two got to do with Night of the Demon? Well, genetically, not very much. But when we look at these two iterations of Cherry Ripe, okay, one that comes from a seance and the other one that comes from a number station, they do begin to overlap. As a medium, Meek offers his larynx to a voice that is not his own. Whilst what's odd about the intercepted number station broadcast is their overt sense of a mysterious origin. This is not just because their locations cannot be fully discerned, but listen to that voice. Where does it come from? Placed side by side, the seance voice and the electronic voice suddenly sound similar, just as ghostly as each other. But whereas Meek purports to communicate with an afterlife, the Cherry Ripe station offers the ghost in the machine, a voice that seems to emanate directly from the channel itself. Now, these two forms of interruption will seem to sum up the ambivalence and the discomfort associated with noise. From static on the line to the incomprehensible code and to the unrecognised voice, noise reminds us that we are not fully in control of our media. However much we feel that we speak, think and communicate through them, they are not only open to interference from others, but they speak, think and communicate for us. This is the territory of H.P. Lovecraft. Although Lovecraft's favourite technology was the book, electromagnetic devices sometimes appear in his work, and when they do, they are almost always bad lines. His story, The Dunwich Horror from 1929, is one of the few in which a telephone appears. Towards the end of the story, an invisible entity rampages through an isolated town. We follow the destruction via a series of frantic phone calls made from house to house. At each point, all that's heard on the end of the line is noise, the screams of the people, the collapsing of the houses, or worse, the unearthly sound of the entity itself. In From Beyond, from 1934, Lovecraft takes this further with his imagined technology, the Tillinghast resonator, a sound device that can open one's vision to the extended spectrum of awareness. These multiple dimensions, we are told, are teeming with predatory alien life forms, a fact that's somewhat unfortunate for the characters involved. The resonator generates a two-way channel, meaning that the creatures can see into human space just as much as the characters can see into theirs. What's offered in these texts is a representation of media horror. This is not taken to signify the representation of the horrific, but the notion that technological mediation opens the subject to a sinister influence. Sinister in the sense of information that deceives or misleads. Lovecraft's telephones and speculative devices are seen to extend human communication, but the zones to which it extends are frequently pernicious. Like the encoded voices of the number station and Meek's xenoglossy, the channel render the voice as noise, as an object of difference, that which comes from someone else and somewhere else. Now, William Burroughs, the writer of Naked Lunch, he knew all about this other side. On August the 6th, 1981, Burroughs could be found hard at work in his New York bunker with the artist Genesis P. Orridge. Strewn across his conference table were all manner of electronic devices and sound recording equipment. Gathering their gear together, Burroughs and P. Orridge set up a reel-to-reel tape recorder and inserted a crystal receiver into the microphone socket. The tape was left to record for half an hour before they scanned what P. Orridge called the expected hiss and short-wave twilight zone sounds for evidence of communication. As P. Orridge recalled, given the deathly weight associated with August the 6th, Hiroshima Day, Burroughs thought it likely that a large number of dead souls might wish to break through. An appropriate image given the source book informing the day's experiment Konstantin Rodiev's breakthrough, electronic communication with the dead might be possible, a book from 1971. Rodiev, you can see here and also here down the bottom, was a Latvian parapsychologist who specialised in EVP, electronic voice phenomena. Again, I think many of you here might be aware of this. Using tape recorders equipped with a diode setup, Rodiev made recordings in silent rooms and direct from unused UHF radio frequencies before subjecting the tapes to repeated playback. He was searching for audible material that had seemingly appeared on the tapes in the absence of any discernible input. And these interruptions, he claimed, were the voices of the dead, vocalic signals transmitted from a post-mortal state of existence. Rodiev wasn't the only investigator in this field. The British acoustic researcher here, Raymond Cass, accumulated an archive of over 2,000 EVP recordings between 1971 and 1977. Cass worked mainly with radio, seizing upon moments of interruption, either within drifts of static or during the course of normal broadcasts. And amongst the voices he alleged to have recording was the recently deceased Konstantin Rodiev. Listen to this. Oh, watch out, not him yet. Okay.
This is Raymond and Ingrid. It's now nearly 6 o'clock on the 23rd of August 1976, and we do invite our friends, many of our friends who have communicated before, to speak to us on this channel of communication, to speak to us, to send their messages. We shall transcribe your voices, and if they're suitable, we'll publish them. So we're very happy to receive your voices, your singing, your music, and we especially welcome Konstantin Rodiev and his friend. Thank you. We'll have to decipher that.
Right, there you are. And what they deciphered that as was a voice saying Konstantin Rodiev in direct response to him saying, "Can we contact Konstantin Rodiev?" Okay, but you have to listen to these a few times apparently to get what this actually been saying. Okay, so it was the second interruption that Cass placed so much emphasis on there. And basically what Cass thought, the way he was seeing this kind of platform of technology, was that the communication he was receiving was made possible by the electromagnetic nature of the afterlife. This was the kind of post-mortal state of existence, and his own abilities as a medium. He was something of an antennae for the entities who sought to communicate via the radio channel. Now then, it's hard to actually doubt the sincerity of Cass, Rodiev, and the other investigators in the field. But at the same time, there's clearly a recapitulation of the productive engagement with noise that underwrites the likes of the wasteland. Burroughs knew this. His act of commemoration, a hailing of the dead of Hiroshima, keys into the powerful work of mourning that tries to fill an absence and feed the into the known. As a sound artist Joe Banks eloquently puts it, Rodiev's work brings together post-1945 recording technology with an emotional agenda inherited from Victorian spiritualism. A powerful belief in an afterlife is projected onto waves of interference in an audiophonic manifestation of the ink block test. Once generated, the recordings are recycled as evidence of a factual basis on which a belief system feeds and grows. EVP recordings are voices generated by the noise of the medium. They are not, as the writer Greg Haynes puts it, resurrections of an origin, but the production of something else entirely. Something else. EVP has had a great influence on a wide range of musicians and sound artists, and again, I'm sure it's familiar to many people here today. Along with number stations, it represents material that carries the clear signature of its technical and media origins. Symbolically, it represents not a gateway to another world, but the self-generation of information. One book that I think works as an unacknowledged primer for this perspective is John Keel's The Mothman Prophecies from 1975. It's essentially an account of Keel's experiences in Point Pleasant in West Virginia between 1966 and 1967. During that time, many of the town's residents reported sightings of a large humanoid creature with blazing red eyes. Dubbed the Mothman by the press, it ultimately came to be seen as a type of thunderbird, a harbinger of doom, particularly as its so-called arrival preceded the disastrous collapse of Point Pleasant's Silver Bridge in December 1967. Keel also reports a spate of UFO sightings, alien visitations, Men in Black scenarios, and time slip events. Unsurprisingly then, the book's often placed as a work of ufology, cryptozoology, if not out-and-out fantasy. But in my mind, I think it's a masterpiece of cybernetic paranoia. Keel's narrative is filled with strange phone calls and distorted recordings. His voice and his phone calls are interrupted, jammed with weird sounds, and his phone also frequently calls even when it's disconnected. Recordings of entire conversations are said to have played back as swathes of white noise, and when he finally traces his line back to its origin, the telephone company, he finds no discernible fault at all. Much of this activity surrounds an entity, or more specifically a voice, that haunts the book called Indrid Cold. Mort Pellinton's film The Mothman Prophecies from 2002 with Richard Gere as John Klein, I think captures this identity perfectly.
Yes. John, thank God you're there. Gordon? Look, I know I sound a little crazy the other day, but things have been getting weird out here.
Slow down, Gordon.
He's here.
Who's here?
Indrid Cold. And he's standing right next to me.
Get over to Gordon's right away. He says Indrid Cold is there. Gordon? Let me talk to him.
Sure. Hang on. Hello, John Clark.
Who is this?
My name is Indrid Cold.
Unless, of course, you're Gordon Small.
Your father was born in Wysing, Wisconsin. He lived in a green house on Monroe Street. You don't remember how your mother looked.
Okay, you got my attention. Where's my watch?
In your shoe. Under the bed.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Terrifying. Okay, so in the scene that follows, that goes. I mean, that's the key part of the film. It's a brilliant film. If no one's seen it, I recommend that you check it out. But in the scene that follows, not only do we find that Indrid Cold was not in the house that the call was made from, but that the voice that Klein hears is not a voice at all, but an electrical impulse on the line itself. Now then, for Keel, the medial status of Indrid Cold backs up his take on the phenomena that he observes throughout the book. It's not, as he says, extraterrestrial, but it's somehow ultra-terrestrial. The work of non-human entities that emanate from the Earth, but which inhabit a wavelength that is all but invisible to the human. Their occasional interruptions are thus highly anomalous and, by extension, charged with significance. Like an unknown voice breaking into a radio broadcast, their appearances generate attempts at comprehension. Indrid Cold isn't the only entity that circulates in the Mothman Prophecies. Keel surveys other contactees and is fascinated by the cryptic names they offer. At one point, he tells us that a woman on Long Island had an encounter with a gentleman in a greenish suit in May 1967, and his name caused me some problems. He calls himself Aphlos. I finally figured out that it was from aphlogistic, a word derived from Greek meaning a lamp giving light without flame. The aphlogistic lamp, also known as the Davy lamp after its inventor, Sir Humphrey Davy, was marketed as a flameless lamp, one that used a coil of wire doused in alcohol to maintain illumination. Obviously extremely useful if you're a miner working in some kind of horrendously flammable environment. Now then, in Keel's term, aphlogistic works as the ideal adjective to describe the encounters. Not because they are artificial in some way, but because they lack an external source. The messages he receives do not come from a sender so much as from the channels he uses to communicate with others. What is a source of horror for Lovecraft is a vast reservoir of information for Keel. To play out the difference, we might remind ourselves that the very distant etymology of horror relates to that which causes one to bristle and to shudder, but also metaphorically to the ruffling and rippling that one can see on the surface of water, the classic portent, a sign of something underneath and yet to come. I offer this because it relates ultimately back to my take on literature. Also, were I to be blessed with the requisite skill to function as an artist, like the brilliant people currently in residence here, this is the direction I'd push my work. I'd make a play to cultivate aphlogistic art. In the sense used by Keel, it hints at a perspective different to that long established in 20th century literary criticism. In his book we see here, The Mirror and the Lamp by M.H. Abrams, Abrams praised the Romantic poets for their outpouring of the soul. Their art was full of extreme sensitivity. It wasn't bound to mimetic accuracy, i.e. a mirror on the world, but acted as a kind of lamp, illuminating the poet's inner self. I think this theoretical stance makes sense for Abrams. During the Second World War, he worked in a psychoacoustic laboratory, tasked with developing a method of battlefield communication that could cut through noise and would thus not be interrupted or obscured by the thunder of war. By some contrast, literature as the aphlogistic lamp speaks not of immediacy, sincerity, or the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, but the non-human voice of language, the systemic noise of writing, and the cryptographic hum and buzz of the transition from thought to symbol. As we're more and more swamped with information and supplemented by various prostheses, such a stance, it seems to offer, to me at least, an appropriate means of thinking through the babble of the contemporary. NASA, strangely enough, offered a glimpse of this when they were recently pressed for a comment on the Earth noises. And they said this: "The Earth has natural radio emissions. If humans had radio antennae instead of ears, we would hear a remarkable symphony of strange noises coming from our own planet. Scientists call them tweaks, whistlers, and ferrics. They sound like background music from a flamboyant science fiction film, but this is not science fiction at all. Earth's natural radio emissions are real, and although we're mostly unaware of them, they are around us all the time. So, given these antennae channeled into art, what would these whistles look like? Probably a lot like sidebands." Thanks. Paul.
So firstly, I want to say, James, thank you so much for that talk. It was a pretty expansive,
Correct.
Full spectrum survey of the field. So I guess I just wanted to talk initially about some of my points that are arriving at some of these subject areas.
Yeah.
And that was particularly so Gordon Pask essentially being the gateway. So uncovering a text called, slightly long-winded title of the text, The Prototypical Application of Cybernetics in Architecture, which was released by Pask, or some Pask researchers in the late 90s. And I guess it was like uncovering Pask's ideas of evolutionary systems, specifically in relation to architecture and the work of the architect Cedric Price. And then from that area kind of leading back and looking back at Norbert Wiener. But I think the thing that's kind of fascinating about thinking about your talk is the sense that cybernetics at its core was a very idealistic sense of the mechanisms of control, the mechanisms of control in response to information. So it's when we think about noise, signal-to-noise ratios, noise floors, within that kind of constellation, there's always, it almost feels inevitable that in man's kind of ongoing quest for kind of control of any aspect of the world, universe, etc., there's always going to be the outsider consequence. And with this, it's the kind of Lovecraftian manifestation of otherness. So anything that's the sense that the unregulatable, the phenomena that kind of exist in that slippage as channels are deployed, and what's kind of mapped onto those through, elements of the unknown. So I guess in the first sense, I was going to maybe ask you to talk a little bit more about Lovecraft's story, particularly, that comes up in your talk. Maybe.
Which what the From Beyond?
It's a depiction. I think you talked about. It's like a village, and there's
The Dunwich Horror.
That's it.
Yeah.
So maybe just to expand on that a little bit.
Dunwich Horror is part of. I don't know what people know about Lovecraft. I think Andy is also of the knowledge, as it were. Yes. And the Dunwich Horror is part. It's one of. It's not so much his longest work, but Lovecraft primarily worked in relation to the short story, and his engagement with the short story is kind of interesting because, to use another phrase that came up from the previous talk, Lovecraft is engaged in a certain kind of fantasy, but in the sense of a world builder, and he accumulates a kind of what he refers to as a mythos over the course of a series of stories. Now, the Dunwich Horror works has a particular place within his particular worldview. It's kind of a longish story, a bit of a novella, but it is about, if you like, the arrival and the manifestation of what he refers to as one of the old ones. Okay, this sort of emanation of some kind of, let's say, atavistic presence on Earth. And a lot of his stories are basically about trying to uncover what this, and chart out and map this sort of cosmic paradigm through a set of its avatars, let's say. And the Dunwich Horror is kind of interesting in relation to that because it shows the manifestation of one of these entities. That's the entity that kind of escapes from an enclosed house and moves through the village towards the end. But it's also linked to the way in which that works through a strange kind of, mode of inheritance. So the manner in which the entity takes form is through a strange kind of scholarly investigation on the part of one of this creature's, if you like, family members, let's say. So whereas in other stories we would often have this as a kind of threat, this possible manifestation, one does not want to go through this ritual because it would be terrible for one of the old ones to be made manifest. Dunwich Horror, that's pretty much where it starts. And we see a kind of rare example of one of these entities given sort of full reign within a particular place.
So I guess just from our initial conversation when we met last week, because I'd seen the Mothman Prophecies, but not actually read the book, and it was something that we revisited with some of the other resident artists here, just as an exercise in kind of exploring that cinematic moment. And I think it was out of our discussions that came out of it, I think one of the most notable kind of considerations was the idea that a lot of this idea set is somehow dependent on the the foundations of analog technology and analog systems. So it's somehow, even when we think about, you know, horror and its manifestations in popular culture, it seems to be like we kind of hit a brick wall as we make that transition from the analog era into the digital. And there's a sense that as the signal to noise ratio, let's say, technologically drops, the capacity for exploring fantastical kind of cosmic, they say ultra-terrestrial phenomena somehow gets more difficult to kind of infuse into the contemporary narrative. So maybe you could talk a little bit about this, let's say, the difficulties of translating these ideas onto kind of digitized society, perhaps.
Yeah. So you had a film night.
We did have a film night
of the Mothman Prophecies.
Yes, we did.
Oh, very good. Excellent. Excellent. All right, good. That's really good to know. Which could have been there. Sorry, about translating these ideas into a digital space.
What's the
right?
What's the capacity for doing that? Is that do you think that there is the kind of the bandwidth somehow drops off as we enter the digital era? But where is that space for that cosmic horror?
Right.
Perhaps.
Okay, fine. Right, good. Sorry, I was just blown away by the brilliant film. No idea. Fine. So I think that if we think about the reading people like Lovecraft in relation to technology is a sort of, if you like, a recent turn within critical attempts to engage with this particular writer. So it's got something to do with interpretative value. Essentially, what should we see as being interesting in the work of this writer who, for a variety of reasons, has been marginalised and rendered peripheral, mainly due to the context through which his writings emerge. That's the first point, and it keys in, I suppose, with what you see elsewhere in a sense of certain media platforms are valorised and have value conferred on them from the perspective, an almost archaeological perspective. Hence, we have phrased media archaeology, right? And various forms of steampunk. It's a kind of retrospective reconfiguration of some kind of value in relation to that which is either devalued, peripheral, or, as another phrase which circulates, dead media. Okay, so there's then, if we look at it from that perspective about retrospectively conferred value, there's obviously then a problem when one looks at one's contemporary moment, because if we think about contemporary as being contemporal, about sharing that temporality, about being close to it, there's a sense that comes with that proximity, which means it's difficult to get a full sense of what this system, let's say, actually is, how does it work, and how does it actually encode certain ideas, what does it actually contribute to the messages that it's conveying. So there is going to be, I think, a problem mapping that certain reading, that particular kind of reading of technology onto the digital sphere, precisely because we are embedded within it, let's say. Precisely because it's still active. We're fabrically intertwined with it.
So does that imply that the potential for, let's say, this exteriorized otherness is only possible as a kind of a retrospective reflection, rather than something that we can kind of assimilate and kind of, integrate into the present? I'm just trying to question whether just listening to that, to think of whether there are examples, because even looking back to the Genesis Peerage, Constantine Radu kind of experiments, that doesn't seem like it's, to me, to look back. Obviously, the tape machine has been a kind of a staple, for 30, 40 years possibly from that moment. But I'm just trying to think, that doesn't to me feel like a kind of an entirely retrospective phenomena when I see them doing that somehow.
Well, I think with EVP, there's two streams that come out of it. There's the technical and, if you like, scientific process. And then I think the part of the reason why that's remained so resonant is, there's a variety of practitioners, and it still has, if you like, a kind of paranormal currency as a primary technique. But if you like, the reason why EVP is so kind of resonant is because it's been absorbed into a kind of creative discourse. And that's, if you like, the retrospective connection to it. Not necessarily seeing this as a kind of valid attempt to communicate with an afterlife, but exploiting the creative implications of that. So I think there's a difference between approaching something like the tape recorder as a convenient and readily available instrument to achieve a certain set of effects. In Rhodey's case, it's convenient for engaging with this particular phenomena. And then, if you like, a creative revaluation of that and its associated materials, which I don't think it necessarily requires a retrospective application, but I think it certainly it takes on that form. I mean, in our conversation last week, we were ranging through all kinds. We're indulging ourselves with the discussion of all kinds of horror films, weren't we? Yeah. And you we also brought the example of, I can't remember which one it is, but one of the recent Hellraiser sequels. We were saying that it's based around the internet. In which the title character is this sort of digital entity. And I think that whilst obviously the digital economy represents an immediate index, it will be interesting if we say we met up and had another horror film conversation in 10 or 15 years, the extent to which that particular representation would look clunky or not. Would lose its potency in terms of what it's trying to get at, in terms of the uncanniness and the ambivalence of that particular technological platform, because it's so suffused with very historically specific representations of what the internet at that time actually represents. Because we look at film like kind of early digital conspiracy thrillers like The Net, and they're so unconvincing because they have the markers of a certain kind of program, and that loses the potency of it. Whereas if, for example, it takes a kind of, if you like, non-literal engagement and, if you like, a symbolization of a particular technology to have an additional set of resonance that gets over that historical specificity.
Yeah. So shamefully, we actually watched The Net last night.
Oh yeah, did you?
Another failed project.
Sounds like a successful project to me.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think in our chat we were talking about, not to be too trashy about it, but thinking about that example of the Hellraiser movies in which Pinhead, the central character, is projected into the internet, and I think at that time it was depicted through a kind of Matrix-esque kind of green digital. So the cover of the box, in fact, is his face made out of this kind of Matrix type graphics. But it's and I remember even at the time kind of having trouble with as someone that had grown up with the history of kind of Arthur Machen, Lovecraft, etc. Somehow seeing these kind of very clunky diffusions of the genre into the digital sphere. But I guess it's like and even thinking about other examples now is, we're talking about this film Unfriended, in which it's, shot entirely inside Skype as a single screen, kind of horror moment. But it seems like, that there's less and less possibility, seemingly now, for the explosion of the genre into the digital field. But maybe it might be something that we might, like I said, reflect back on 10 or 15 years later, and it might feel very different, but it's... Yeah, the digital does seem to encounter some problems in its potential to infuse this kind of exteriorized potential.
I think maybe that might unconsciously be something about just one thing I'm kind of interested in, and I think I currently am writing a project about William Burroughs and tape recorders, and that's why the Burroughs reference was in there. And I think my take on thinking about literature and writing and technology, or if you like, audiovisual technology, which supplements the literary, is that something I try to put emphasis on and try to also clarify my thinking is a sense of getting a sense of precisely what this form is, how does it actually operate, what is its operational specificity. And I think maybe in terms of the kind of the ideas that you're highlighting about the, if you like, the lack of some kind of aesthetic potency with some of these digital images, maybe that may have something to do with a certain line of thinking about precisely how this platform works. Because if we think about the notion of the analog, there is something there about a certain kind of tactility there is something there about the way in which that technology works, about leaving an impression, about it being indexical in that sense, because it indicates and carries the markers of the event that determined the recording, right? In the sense of there is some kind of adjustment of the medium in relation to the voice or other kind of print that's actually placed on it, which symbolically is a very potent, very powerful idea. Whereas I think with the digital, precisely because it has that decimated nature, precisely because it has, if you like, that simulated nature, I think, if you like, the index and the signature of anxiety and the signature of fear is going to move away from that sense of being somehow umbilically connected to the recording.
Okay, just as another point, I guess I was going to refer back to Cybernetic Serendipity, the 1968 exhibition at the ICA, which was recently revisited at the ICA, and with its counterpart, Cybernetic Serendipity Music, being kind of reissued on vinyl. So I guess it was like, to me personally, what seems exciting about that cultural moment, let's say, was the arrival of various disciplines that crossed from kind of art, design, music, information theory, mathematics, the biological sciences, the potential for all of these to be kind of unified in one singular kind of cultural proposition. And I think it was interesting almost to think about the afterglow of that moment, and thinking that somehow things kind of dropped off somewhere. You know, there was so much potential. You get quite romantic about it. So much potential, which somehow kind of resulted in the subsequent decades into kind of an over-specialisation within the arts. So it's kind of, we look back now at that moment of the late 60s, early 70s with a kind of a slightly kind of joyous nostalgia of the possibility of a kind of a multidisciplinary type of practice, or a kind of landscape of what the arts could have looked like. And I guess I'm trying to think about how to, I guess like within my research here at Wysing, that's going to be something that's inevitably at the core of how I'm going to be thinking, I guess, like how to kind of connect the dots and almost kind of reimagine the potential of that moment. I guess it's like maybe it would be nice to hear about some of your ideas of Cybernetic Serendipity, the exhibition, and how you arrived at them, and I guess like what you see within your work, what seems to be a value within that project.
Well, I certainly agree with you that it has the sheen of. Are we okay for time?
Yeah, maybe make a comment on that.
Yeah, fine. I thought you were doing the classic terminal gesture. Okay. All right. Okay, fine. Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right in the sense that there's something of an optimism, isn't there, about that work? There's something of a joyous experimentalism about that work, and there's something also about, certainly looking through the exhibits, there's a kind of willingness to be contingent and offer work which is almost in process, in the sense of this is a work and it is there as a running experiment, and if you like, we will see what the results are and gain some value from that. I do think it is very much of its time, mid to late 1960s, because you can quite easily see that optimistic drive in other areas of the arts and certainly education, because I think that it would be productive to see a connection between something like cybernetic serendipity and the free universities or the anti-university. Certainly the way that the anti-university was marketed and promoted in International Times, they frequently printed its intended syllabus, and there's lots about cybernetics, there's lots about information theory, there's lots of proposed courses about notions of communication. So I think the promise, if you like, of cybernetics, which is offering productive creativity, essentially interdisciplinarity, a variety of parties working to some kind of ideal, it seems to operate as a very appropriate analogue to a kind of countercultural ethos, broadly understood. as you say, the afterglow of it, it's quite easy to see a lot of 60s projects, let's say, as these things which are short-lived. They come to some kind of burnout. The anti-university didn't really happen or exist because no one was in charge. But I think that it's not. I don't really think it kind of disappeared. It was just that particular rhetoric of artistic creativity in relation to those ideas dissipated, but the ideas themselves persisted. Because certainly, I mean, I'd see a direct development or parallel to something like cybernetic serendipity is the way in which the Whole Earth catalogue was organised, the kind of things that were distributed through it, and the, if you like, the commercial networks that established from that. And I think certainly a lot of, if you like, institutional infrastructure seems to be the outgrowth of a lot of these ideas which have been discussed and represented, let's say, in cybernetic serendipity.
Yeah, that was actually funny you should say that. But, in terms of the Whole Earth catalogue, one of the texts that I've been revisiting is this book called Cybernetics on Cybernetics, which was funded by Stuart Brand, the Whole Earth catalogue. So it's kind of, and it's a great kind of, in the spirit of that kind of psychedelic West Coast kind of moment. It's kind of an exploration of cybernetics through that viewpoint, and it kind of comes with a book, a meta book, in which like Stuart Brand's annotated, and so it's kind of I think that's another point of like thinking of that kind of the looseness of thought, the links between certain aspects of kind of psychedelic countercultural thinking, and the potential for that to kind of fold back onto quite machinic, mechanized approaches to organisation of society and systems. Yeah. There's definitely quite a kind of potent energy to kind of be explored there, revisited. I was going to say thank you, James, for your talk. And at this point, I'm actually going to... I think we should open it up to questions. So if anyone would like to ask something, please go ahead. Okay.
Cool. I think a good example of a work that engages with the internet in that sort of eerie way that James suggested works well in retrospect, but not exclusively in retrospect, would be Marble Hornets. Something James might like to speak a little bit about.
Yeah, Marble Hornets. Does anyone know what Marble Hornets is? No? Okay. Well, it's an online series based around the discovery of a set of camcorder tapes from an incomplete film, sort of post-Blair Witch. The project is a series of postings on YouTube of we don't know whether it's an episodic sequence, but it's or footage from the film, but it seems to be, which again I think would link very productively to the notion of a dark archive. We don't know whether this is a film being reconstructed through a set of episodes, or indeed, if you like, a kind of posting charting of someone trying to make sense of it. But the film, so much as we can discern, is about the disappearance, or I think it's the disappearance or the unwillingness of the participants to continue. But the classic hook, which I think everyone has in mind when we think about this, is this is where we get the I suppose the tulpa, the current thought form that is the Slender Man from, which people might be aware of. And there's the sense that there's some kind of individual, let's say, or perhaps some kind of entity that makes its presence known on these tapes. And I think certainly, I think there's a very interesting connection. I think it's a brilliant example from Justin there to bring that in here, because Marble Hornets and the whole Slender Man mythos, which is very much a mythos in the Lovecraftian sense, is, I think, very much, and I'm not going to say uniquely, but I think it's very much a kind of an extension of the kind of Indrid Cold myth, the Mothman myth. And if you allow yourself the vertiginous pleasure of Googling some of these ideas, which is an experience in and of itself utterly psychedelic, because it is not unlike falling down a rabbit hole. If you begin to Google some of these names, Indrid Cold comes up in very close proximity to the Slender Man. And there's all kinds of online networks which are connecting these things together, sometimes with a tricksterish impact, other times not. Other times with a kind of not even paranoid, a kind of intentional, anxiety-fueled desire to connect these things together. So yeah, absolutely, I think the thing that might be interesting there is that it also works as a basis of camcorder tapes being uploaded to YouTube. So its proliferation comes from the particularity of its digital platform, but it also has this residue of the analog with it also.
Any other questions?
Probably one more question.
So thinking about many of these discourses as sort of self-consciously non-expert, here think about ufology, to some extent cybernetics, how does this perhaps link to ideas of unknowing that we saw in the previous talk?
Yeah, I think that works really well, and certainly this is something I was thinking about while I was listening to the previous presentation. The field of, if you like, ufology sort of prides itself, I think, well, this might be slightly controversial. I apologise online to any ufologists watching. It prides itself on being, in a variety of ways, the kind of last vestige of the amateur investigator, and I mean amateur, not in, again, it's requiring the same kind of distinctions, which I think is very productive. Not amateur in the sense of lacking skill, not amateur in the sense of lacking a vocation or a degree of proficiency and professionalism, but being in some way, if you like, non-academic, non-institutional, let's say. And Keel is a really good example to bring up here, because he was a journalist, writer, and he had a press pass, but he also had a business card, a calling card that just said, John Keel, not an authority on anything. Right? So he would introduce himself as utterly inexpert. And I think that kind of makes sense in the sense of the proliferation of it, and you often find that evidence plays a strange role in lots of these discourses. If you need evidence, you do not believe, all these kind of things in the way that it connects with a certain kind of faith. But thinking back to Keel and thinking about the work that a lot of these ufologists are doing, it requires that in-between status of the investigator. It requires the non-disciplinary status of it, not because they are not rigorous, but, and this is maybe a connection with the idealism of cybernetics, it requires someone who can bring lots of fields together to precisely deal with the anomalies that are being, the stupefying nature of these events. And if you look at the book, which it seems that has been circulated, Keel's bringing all kinds of ideas together, linguistics and psychology and and journalism and all kinds of ideas to try to deal with this. So I think the position of the investigator in that sense, the kind of amateur detective, let's say, is very much in line with what we heard earlier.
So I think on that note, I think we've had our time, so we'll break now. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to you, James and Paul, for putting input into this presentation. It was really amazing, and for the conversation. We'll have a comfy break now with more tea and coffee, and then we return with a screening of Essi Kausalainen. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Great. So what we'd like to do is, in our conversation, primarily talk about Essi's work, and perhaps in a bit move on to talk about how research functions within that, and also touch on the work of Karen Barad, which has inspired both of us and brought our books together today. Hopefully there'll be some resonances with ideas of intelligibility from the first talk, and perhaps even radio antennae. But so let's start with a video and a broad theme of collaboration. Obviously there's collaboration in terms of the children, but also the plants, which perhaps is a more significant relationship.
Yeah, for quite many years I have been making work in collaboration with plants, and for last 3 years also with a plant biologist. So I think there was making this video was I started to work on this video in 2012, and it was this shift in my work. I had been doing quite a long time solo performances, performed mainly in the context of performance art festivals. And I had arrived to the point where I was quite tired of all of that. I was tired of working alone, being there on the stage alone and being looked at, and also this constant traveling of coming and going and not being able to define the context of the work. So the invitation came from the plants, and I started really seriously to look into that. I was greatly influenced by Michael Marder's book Plant Thinking, and several concepts in that book I feel opened my practice, and the opening towards the collaboration was one of the keys. And this comes from, I think, the core of this idea of collaboration is that I was quite curious in exploring the possibility to perform plant logic. And to start with, plant is never one, but it's always a group. So how to perform the logic of this group would mean to form these kind of temporary collectives or groups to work with. So that's kind of the starting point. If we want to go more into the plant thinking, or should we kind of...
I think so. I think it's good to draw that out. How does that collaboration manifest itself in a daily basis?
With plants or with other people? I think it's while we are here talking about my work, I don't think it's mainly talking about the practice. And the practice is influenced by this idea of plant thinking, and the practice is influenced greatly what Karen Barad is writing, the concept of, well, interaction, but what Karen Barad is calling, not interaction, but interaction. So the process of where bodies are, different kind of bodies are shaping each other and being shaped. So for me, kind of the starting point is to take the plant seriously, to look at the plant body and its possible sensitivities, its possible thinking or intellect. What could that mean? What does it mean? Like, and first I was working quite intuitively through observing, through spending a lot of time with plants. And I think one of the key things also is to understand or acknowledge the different time scales. So the time scale of my body is quite different from the plant. And of course, if you think about the grass or a big tree, there's very different kind of time scales. And also plant, because it has this, for example, it can travel through time. in the form of seeds. So they have found these magnolia seeds that are 3,000 years old, and they have been able to grow a tree out of those. So it's kind of this totally different timescale. So one thing is how to tune into that timescale of a plant. But it all comes, like I said, it's about this respect and taking these other bodies seriously.
And there's an interesting parallel, I think, in temporality of your works, in the sense that this was barely 2 minutes, and then some performances are nearly 100 hours. Is that something that stemmed from getting to know the temporality of plants?
Yes, yes, definitely. I think I'm the collaboration started with plants, and slowly, by working with plants, I was encouraged to also invite other people and other non-human bodies to work with me, and that kind of opened up like this kind of awareness of these different temporalities. So you might think about insect time, or plant time, or fungi time, or mineral time, or the human time, or the time of internet, and there's many different layers, and just through exploring, creating action and doing and being in these different temporalities, it's a way for me to approach these non-human bodies.
And there seems to be a repeated theme of ceremony as well with these different bodies, or the ceremonial, maybe even ritual.
Yeah, it is very interesting how this idea of a ritual is often brought into the work, even I'm not intending it. I'm quite comfortable with the idea of ceremony, because I think, at least myself, but I think human in more general sense, we have this tendency of creating ceremonies. And for me, I'm talking about this very mundane things, like making the breakfast, which kind of, in its repetition, I think this is what I really like, for example, in this being in residencies, is you familiarize yourself with other people and they kind of daily rituals, how do they start their day, how do they end their days, all these kind of small things. So I think it's about this ceremonial element that I'm interested. But then it's also, like you said, well, we talked earlier about this video, and you kind of saw there this ceremonial quality, and even this kind of thing of purification or healing. When making that work, I'm thinking about ecosystems. So it's kind of, I think my work, it comes from this very practical, very concrete things, but it's very important for me in the structuring the work is to give this openness and somehow the space. I'm thinking about it as a space for the audience to enter the work and make their own reading, and kind of, because I think often the audience is more intelligent than I am, so I kind of like, I need to give space for that intelligence and also the sensitivity to read the work.
Maybe that's a good time to look at the quotes that we have. So how should we do it? Shall I read?
Yes.
Shall I read them?
Read it.
So we pulled out, Essi pulled out a couple of quotes from this Karen Barad text, Meeting the Universe Halfway. And so I'm going to read the first one, but it's also here on the screen. There's an important sense in which practices of knowing cannot fully be claimed as human practices, not simply because we use non-human elements in our practices, but because knowing is a matter of part of the world making itself intelligible to another part. Practices of knowing and being are not isolable. They're mutually implicated. We don't obtain knowledge by standing outside the world. We know because we are of the world. We are part of the world in its differential becoming. The separation of epistemology from ontology is a reverberation of a metaphysics that assumes an inherent difference between human and non-human, subject and object, mind and body, matter and discourse. Onto-epistemology, the study of practices of knowing in being, is probably a better way to think about the kind of understandings that we need to come to terms with how specific intra-actions matter. Or for that matter, what we need is something like an ethico-onto-epistemology, an appreciation of the intertwining of ethics, knowing and being, since each interaction matters, since the possibility for what the world may become call out in the pause that precedes each breath before a moment comes into being and the world is remade again, because the becoming of the world is a deeply ethical matter. So that's the first one.
Yeah, I think it's somehow, when reading this book, when reading Karen Barat's thinking, it resonated greatly in me, because I feel I'm not a very articulate person in language. I think language is somehow a very complicated issue for me. I always feel a sense of failure or lack, that I'm not being able to articulate what I'm trying to, I'm not able to say what I'm trying to say. And that is also the reason why I've make my work through doing and being instead of, for example, writing. So then this kind of knowing that the plant has, it was kind of, for me, there's something very interesting in that, and in the fact, like, how do I approach this kind of knowledge, the thinking that happens without the brain, that Michael Marder calls thinking before thinking, because it doesn't involve this analytical process, but it's kind of instant. But also it's not just reacting. This is one reason why I felt the need to collaborate with the plant biologist to kind of check the facts, because I'm quite interested in, or for me, the kind of actual world is the fantastic world. So it's kind of, it's so strange when you start to look at it and when you start to look at the details. So this kind of approaching the plant's way of knowing through my work, through my practice, and by spending time with them.
And how did the collaboration with the plant biologist work? Was he or she very open to your approach?
Matthew Robson, he's works in Helsinki University, and he's been extremely open and supportive, and it's kind of, our collaboration is structured in the way that he's the specialist and I'm the artist, and I'm the one asking questions from a maybe a bit surprising viewpoint, but he's also been very open to be part of my performances. He's been performing, he's been giving talks inside these my abstract or ceremonial or a little bit crazy, funny, silly things that I do, but he's been very, very open to do that. And also he's given some of my texts, like Michael Marder's or people like this, to his students to read. So kind of there is this subtle exchange, and that is still ongoing.
That's great. And maybe that's a good time to hear a little tiny bit about what you're researching here.
Yeah.
With the fungi and the mycorrhiza.
Yes, I feel that working with the plants, I've created a series of work that has been exploring this possibility to perform plant logic, and I feel it's kind of, it has come to its end, but it's also from this point it's opening towards new territories. So it's opening towards fungi, mushrooms, mycelium. I'm especially interested in how the plants use the mycelium, the mycorrhiza, in their communication. And I'm interested in the queerness of fungi, how we always, when we, in biology classes, we are taught that fungi, it's not an animal, and it's not a plant, and it's somehow in between, and also its role as this kind of mediator between the plants, or maybe some researchers or these people who popularize the research talk about the mycorrhiza as the internet of plants. So this kind of technological reference, and there's something really interesting in there. And I will be meeting a professor from Cambridge University in 1 week time to talk about this and to find out more. Because I think this is also an important part of my working, is kind of creating these contacts and communication, talking with people instead of only reading books. I think there's these moments of exchange and this kind of the attempt to articulate something, and this openness. Like in this situation, like I think we decided to take a little bit of risk because we wanted to keep this conversation very open for surprising things to appear. And I think this is also related to the thinking of Karen Barad, that our being is all about meeting, and in this meeting, these meeting points are open, and that means there's always this possibility that the future is open. There's always possibility for new things to arise, for things to take new directions.
Like sharing your reading with the students of the plant biologist, for instance, which wouldn't be possible if you simply read his research, I suppose. Should we read the next citation? So, this is the closing paragraph of the book, actually. A delicate tissue of ethicality runs through the marrow of being. There is no getting away from ethics. Mattering is an integral part of the ontology of the world and its dynamic presencing. Not even a moment exists on its own. This and that, here and now, don't pre-exist what happens, but come alive with each meeting. The world and its possibilities for becoming are remade with each moment. If we hold on to the belief that the world is made of individual entities, it is hard to see how even our best, most well-intentioned calculations for right action can avoid tearing holes in the delicate tissue structure of entanglements that the lifeblood of the world runs through. Intra-acting responsibility as part of the world means taking account of the entangled phenomena that are intrinsic to the world's vitality and being. The world's vitality and being responsive to the possibilities that might help us and it to flourish. Meeting each moment, being alive to the possibilities of becoming, is an ethical call, an invitation that is written into the very matter of all being and becoming. We need to meet the universe halfway, to take responsibility for the role that we play in the world's differential becoming.
But this was also something that was important to you, this?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of entanglement, I think, I still feel like her work's so vast, it's hard to quickly digest, but I suppose, personally, most of my own work is in collaboration with others in some way, and I suppose a lot of the historical practices that I'm interested in, feminist and queer practices, tend to have that aspect of collaboration, and there's always these thorny issues of authorship, for instance, and how value authorship is attributed. And I think what fascinates me about this articulation is how much it complicates that, but also is very precise about the effect of everything and every decision on everyone, which sort of blows everything up in a way that's very exciting. I haven't quite come to terms with, maybe.
Yeah, I think for me it's kind of approaching this book, it was kind of through the concept of plant intelligence and this kind of opening to the awareness that there's this great sensitivity, different forms of sensitivities around us, and this ethical approach that Karen Barad is talking about makes a lot of meaning with that.
I'm wondering if we have one more tack before opening it up, which I really wanted to, Essi told me a beautiful story about her encounter with an MRI scanner and its sound.
Yeah, and this is related, like you might wonder how MRI is connected to the plants and thinking, but this is what I'm figuring out. I know there is a connection between the fungi, the mycorrhiza, and the MRI machine, and I have now 4 weeks time to find out what it is. But you can talk about it more.
No. I mean, that was. I had a sort of wider question about sound in your work, but particularly the sound of the MRI machine, because what was particularly fascinating was its inability to be recorded.
Yeah.
Because of its own action, as it were.
So working with these non-human beings, bodies, I've been developing a practice of approaching and observing them, and I just happened to have this extremely exciting experience of being in one of these scanners last summer, and the machine totally impressed me with its great sound and resonance. And as you can maybe get a little bit of idea in the video you saw, there's not much sound in my work. It's quite quiet. It's mainly the sound of actions, things being done. There's very little language because of the reason I just explained. But now I'm very interested in introducing the sound of this MRI machine to the video, because it just is the experience of being with the machine through the sound, through the sensation of the resonance of the sound in my body, and the awareness that I was inside the machine and the machine was scanning inside me, and I was inside this bigger system of the medical institution or the medical technology. There was a person outside the machine, outside me, kind of reading or taking the readings. So there was something really meaningful in that experience for me, and I'm trying to point out what it is. So I asked when Donna and Lotte contacted me, they Skyped me and asked me, what would you like to do? What would you be interested in during the stay in Wysing? I said I would like to learn something about fungi, and I would like to record an MRI scanning machine. And they've been doing all this detective work, like where I could go and how I could record and then it turned out that actually they were saying that it's supposed, this is what they say, that it's actually impossible to record it, or it might be very tricky to record it because of this this great magnetic force field that the machine creates. So there's something really interesting for me in this kind of this refusal of not being, like the sound being very dominated, or for me that was the most dominated character of that machine. But then at the same time it refuses to be recorded. But then they have this fake sound, some kind of imitation of the sound that is made for the people who are afraid to go into these research, which I found somehow something very beautiful in this idea of getting to know to this machine through its sound, listening to it and kind of familiarizing yourself with the sound, and then kind of preparing yourself to enter it. So now I have, I think, 5 or 6 sound files to work on. Yeah.
Great. Should we open it out to questions?
We have the moth.
Oh, the moth. We've done it all the wrong way around, I think.
Yeah.
So we actually met on an incredible. This is probably more demonstrative. A credible trip here with the other artists, with Paul and Erica, that Lotte took us on to. What's the exact name?
The Mola Radio Telescope Observatory.
So it's part of the Cambridge University astrophysics, I suppose. So it's a sort of mostly an active graveyard of radio telescopes. And in one of the rooms, one of the control rooms, because all of these have control rooms somewhere, one of the really old control rooms we were in, there was a story. This is just a close-up, but if you can imagine, it's a bit like images of sort of nuclear power stations or spaceships. This is just a close-up of one part of some of the tape that would have been recording, and the story was that the experiment was going on 24 hours a day, and then people would be staying overnight to watch the machinery, but after a certain point they didn't want to do that, so they wanted to leave it running all night, so they would leave and then come back in the morning and there'd be absolutely nothing on the tape. It would have stopped, and this kept going on, and then finally they realized that there was a small light that stayed on, I can't point, somewhere just above the tape. And so every night a moth, or maybe a series of moths, was coming to that light, attracted to the light, and jamming the tape. And I guess this, for me, at the time, was extremely redolent of a sort of Baradian notion of the extended apparatus. So the scanning apparatus for the radio recording device was somehow being affected very directly by the attraction of the moth, which is quite a beautiful analogy, which sort of, there's an echo in Karen Barrad's book where she's talking about this Stern-Gerlach experiment. And Stern, I think, was the younger of the two men, and he was significantly more working class, and this became extremely significant because he was smoking a much cheaper brand of cigars that included sulfur in the cigar, or larger amounts of sulfur, and actually it took his breath with its sulfurous tobacco in order to develop the film with the silver sulfide, perhaps. So in the end, the experiment actually has to rely on his class status as a researcher in order to function at all. So,
yeah, we have been totally jumping around because we are talking of issues of the universal scale. We are talking about the plants and fungi and astrophysics and moths. So I think it's maybe makes sense to open for questions, so we can kind of direct or go to the direction whatever seems interesting to you, or if you're up for the drinks, and then that's also possible. But maybe that someone wants to ask something. Yes.
How do they record these imitations of the MRI scanner? They get musicians in or something?
I would imagine. I didn't get the description how it is made, but I would imagine there's actually someone simulating the sounds, trying to recreate it.
It has to be from memory, I guess. Yeah. By definition.
Yeah. Not like the physics of this. What I'm saying, it's not done from the physics of how the sound will be generated. Yeah.
Do you know more about it? Because you've been kind of communicating.
Yeah, he didn't actually explain the details of how it was made. But he did tell me that actually a musician has used it for music composition.
Yeah.
So there's definitely an appreciation of kind of this, that it is a sonic score that is being made by someone. But I don't know. I can't really say who made it because he didn't tell me.
Can I add to that? This is like a strange phenomenon because I've had exactly the same experience and then gone to them and said, can I record the scanner? And they said, no, lady, you can't, because you can't use recording equipment inside the room with it because it will wipe out the recording equipment. It cannot possibly happen. But then I had that experience, and it was partly based upon the fact that I was quite anxious about the whole experience. I sort of remembered it with quite such sort of force, but the sound was amazing.
It wasn't. But this is something that we are all falling in love with.
I've heard it too.
Attracted, by the sound, and it's something kind of that changes you.
But I think this is fungal.
Yeah.
Because then on Facebook, Mark Rother posted up, just had an MRI scan. It was amazing.
Oh, wow.
I want to record the sound. And there was about two or three other people that I've noticed who've also done this. And the only reason I'm noticing is because I had a similar experience to you.
Yeah.
But I wonder what that is a collective sort of response to.
But I think there's definitely is something, because for me there was this something meaningful in that experience. There was something, I don't know, exchange, but something, somehow, it was so intimate moment with this machine. And the sound is quite, I don't know, maybe not everyone has been in this machine, so it's really loud, so you have to wear this kind of ear protection, and it's still, but it's kind of, it comes to this very cellular level, so it's kind of penetrates your whole body.
Because I took the headphones off
You
and
did?
got into it.
Yeah? Oh!
Well, it was the only way of dealing with it, because it was so sort of overwhelming.
Yeah.
I had to sort of just, I mean, I pretended it was techno.
Yeah.
I just went, right, I'm in the machine and I'm doing it.
But there's something, and maybe there's also this moment of surrendering to it, kind of opening to it. And I think this is something that the plants have taught me, the importance of softening, of becoming more and more sensitive. So there's something, maybe something like that.
There's a song by Charlotte Gainsbourg. Actually, it's the same. She's had an MRI scan.
Yeah.
And it's inspired by that, but she makes it into sort of industrial and dance music.
Yeah. Yeah. Ah, wow, this is so interesting. Yeah.
Oh, I was just wondering about like the fungi and this also with this machine. Is there something about like the unmediated or some kind of direct experience or direct form of communication that seems to, again, like when we go back what we talked about, like evade capture in some way? Or
Karen Barad talks about embodiment, kind of from going from representation to embodiment, and this kind of taking the empirical seriously again. I think that makes a lot of sense to my worldview and my understanding of the world. So yes, definitely. And this, embodiment, and this, for me then, Karen Barad is writing about brittle star, which is this sea creature that doesn't have eyes, but of which surface is covered by this calcite structure, and which is actually an optical instrument. So basically, it is an animal with no eyes, but it's all eyes. And this is very similar to plant, because plants are super sensitive to lights, and they're very sensitive to different wavelengths of sensing different colors. So it's kind of kind of being with the world, like reading the work or understanding the world through this kind of being this one sensory system. So there's something in that kind of the unmediated, and this kind of these forms of knowledge and understanding. Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting that we started from the stupidity and then we talk about the plant intellect, and there's this kind of, I think, different aspects of.
Well, I was actually interested in a connection there, which is to talk about the status, perhaps, of thinking or intelligibility in that work. Because looking at the Karen, where am I going with this? The Karen Barad quote places a lot of emphasis on becoming, and not on the idea that one might secure, it seems to me, I've not read the book, what one knows in the ontological in some sort of stable way, so to make some sort of claim to. So I'm just wondering, in the act of wanting to produce an understanding of plant thinking, what is the intended outcome of that? Are you trying to, in a sense, pose a thesis for what that might be, or what are the ethics of your investigation?
I think
and how does one manage that?
Yeah, the starting point is of course total failure, because I know I'm never going to be able. But I think it's this gesture of trying to understand, of being with, kind of committing myself, paying attention and being with the plant, and an exploration of kind of the gesture of trying. And then also talking with the plant biologist and kind of how much we can know and what is the point, like also asking from him how much he thinks, like if there will be a day when we will be able to understand the plant logic and these kind of the limitations of our understanding, and kind of it's totally because we cannot understand each other. There's always this kind of lacks and leaking and failing and miscommunication. So how could we totally understand the logic of another kind of a body? So of course not, but it's just for me, making the work is a process of kind of understanding, of embodying the thinking. So for me now I need to make my work to process, for example, this book, to kind of see also, because I think the way Karen Barras is writing is all about, I feel it's starting to produce, it's kind of creating practice, kind of between me and the book. And of course it's kind of like, so the book, I feel I'm shaping the book because it's becoming more soft, and staying in my studio is kind of starting to curve, but also I definitely feel this way the book is starting to shape me. And there's this moment that I've been reading this book that I actually can physically feel my brain stretching, or some kind of new connection. It's this kind of tickling feeling in the brain, kind of something is happening. So I feel it's kind of also influencing me. Like the plants, they have totally changed the collaboration with the plants have totally changed my worldview and my being and my everything.
And in that sense, there might be something mimetic, in as much as the borderline between thinking and acting seems to me within that quotation from Barrett. There's a certain collapse that actually thinking is a form of action and of doing and an ongoing action. Yeah. And in as much as for you to process it, you must act. And the thinking in your work, or the working through all of that, is the doing of some sort of performance of an understanding.
Yeah. And this kind of the idea of kind of mimicking, it's also, for example, for me, this plant logic, it was very important to me to understand what are the things that are important to plant, and then approach them through my own way, instead of trying to, like someone asked, oh, are these girls in the video, are they kind of performing trees? And that was not my idea, but of course it's kind of quite easy way to read it, and you're totally free to do that. But there is this kind of trying to understand the logic, at least a fragment of it, and then approach from that. And but if to understand a logic that is non-linguistic, I think you have to approach it through doing. Yeah.
This is a bit left field. But trying to link MRI scans to fungi.
Yeah.
I've been through the strange process of a dynamic MRI brain scan. And that was basically trying to work out how on earth my brain works and trying to see what I do when I think.
Yeah.
And they were essentially a process of, they were piping through the headphones. Sort of various thoughts and images and scripts to see how my brain reacted when I was thinking.
Yeah.
And it took a very long time, you can imagine. There used to be these really odd moments of kind of peace, where you suddenly get an image of a sunset and no noise, to try and get my brain to relax and then start again. It was exhausting, but very interesting. And what they were doing was recording me thinking.
It was research.
And it was research. Oh, it was being a guinea pig. And I thought that was interesting, because the idea that they were recording dynamic information, and that we still don't really know how we think.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe links to that idea, perhaps do fungi record, have a dynamic role, recording information, or in that kind of interacting, that kind of thing. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
that is.
I think the idea of recording processes like that is quite interesting. Also, the fact we don't really know how we think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we actually know very little about our own species.
Yeah, but maybe that kind of MRI scan, a dynamic MRI scan, would be more useful.
Yeah, that's very. Do you feel that the experience changed you? Was something different?
Yeah, it was weird. It was tiring.
Yeah,
and very noisy. And
that was noisy.
It was quite fascinating as well.
Yeah.
Once you go over the fear, do I have any metal implants? I'm going to explode out.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm not being told something.
You will find
Those
out.
alien probes. I don't know, but so it was weird, and it was quite metaphysical.
Yeah.
And it was really isolating in a really interesting way. But then, of course, they sent me back images of my brain thinking, but they couldn't really tell me much.
Exactly, yeah.
They couldn't really, that's why it's so interesting. It's because they still can't quite extrapolate the results.
I'm given to understand they're quite vague, aren't they?
Yeah.
They don't really show that much.
So again, it sort of intensifies the mystery rather than revealing anything.
Is this fMRI?
Yeah, isn't it dynamic? I'm not sure. Is it fMRI? Might be. I'm
That's
not sure.
functional.
Yeah, that probably is that. So
That's
basically,
records
yeah, so that was
blood
probably
flow,
it.
essentially.
But
So it's a bit of latency. Yeah.
Probably was.
But this is very interesting idea, kind of the fungi as a recorder, because plants are also, they of course record all they experience in the, because the only way of acting is
talking with being like an information system in a way that other plants aren't.
Yeah, and how they so you can see kind of the history of the plant in its shape. So it's I will ask this from this mycologist that I'm planning to. Can fungi record? Thank you for that. Yes.
I was just wondering about some of the visual choices that you made with the film, because I thought that one of the things I kind of enjoyed was the setting. To me, seemed really as if it was a school play.
Yeah.
And with one of the girls wearing their sports kit, I was just wondering whether that was how much of that was a deliberate choice to have her wearing a kind of football kit, whether that's intentional or just she
there was with the process with the girls. It was I made that work in a residency in the Finnish countryside, where I visited local school because I got this idea that I need a child to perform with me. So I went to this classroom, I gave a short presentation of my work, and there were these 3 girls there. So this is kind of very typical for my way of working, that instead of casting them, I kind of sent out an invitation and wanted to see who are the ones or ones who respond. So these were the 3 girls who happened to be the best friends. And then also with the kind of with the aesthetics, for example with the clothing, I asked them to bring different kind of clothes that they feel comfortable in, and we kind of made the decisions a little bit together.
We didn't speak in the end about working with children specifically.
No, we didn't.
I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
The different performative quality of younger people.
Yeah, I think for me it made sense to work with children because of they have this capability to connect with my work. I think it's mainly because of this quite physical approach. I think until they become teenagers, there is this certain physical, not so analytical approach maybe. So it's kind of this trying things out with their bodies, so they seem to feel comfortable of doing things with me and trying things out, and then of course we talk about also the more abstract kind of side of it, but yeah, it's kind of, we always start from the doing and being together.
And how do they respond to the research? Or the more
I think it's kind of with children. I've done a couple of performances involving children, and it depends. Like some are more curious, some are kind of okay, plants, okay, let's do this, and some want to know more. But I think with them they're very easily connected to this idea of plant thinking and plant communication. It's not so weird to them that is for most grown-ups. Yeah. Is it on?
I think, yeah.
That does lead to a nice anecdote about that room, actually.
Yeah.
And children. Don't know if you remember when we went into this particular room, which hasn't been used for 20 years or something like that, this control room at the astronomy place. The guy who was showing us around said, oh yeah, well, there hasn't been any power to these machines for 15 or 20 years, but I had this school group in here a couple of weeks ago, and ever since they've been here, there's this light that won't go off. And I've tried every single switch in this room and can't get the light to go off. And it's like, these children sort of, yeah, they'd find this light source in this machine, and it wasn't going to switch off. And he was flicking all these switches, still trying to find. He said, someday I'm going to find out where the switch is. But it's quite strange because, as far as he was concerned, there was no power going into that room at all. So.
Yeah, I think there's this great, the curiosity and openness, kind of trying things out and approaching the world and surrounding with this great openness and curiosity. Yeah, that's something I really admire. Yes.
Yeah, on that note, I think it's thanks a lot, Donna, for coming in with that anecdote. I think it was incredible, mysterious, but playful and open, actually. So I think it's just been, I just have to say, it's just been such an amazing afternoon. I really appreciate, all of you contributing. So Erica and Paul, James and Paul, and you two, Essi and Irene. It's been really fascinating and really, I hope it's been stimulating for you as well here among audience. And I would love, if we could continue the discussion over a drink in the reception area, if everyone are happy to do that. We've also put out quite discreetly some evaluation forms. So if anyone is happy to fill out, it's just nice for us to hear as well your thoughts from audience, what you felt about today and what came out of it for your point of view. So it's just been, really, really huge thanks to all of you contributing today. And I hope all of these discussions, this is a starting point. So I hope really all of these discussions will continue either together or individually within your work. So yeah, a huge applause to all of you.
2